It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the noise and stress of city life. A few friends and I had rented a cabin in the woods, far from any civilization. The kind of cabin you'd imagine in a postcard, rustic, cozy, with a crackling fire and the scent of pine filling the air. I was looking forward to the peace and quiet. We didn't plan on doing anything crazy, just some hiking, cooking over an open fire, and catching up. The first day was perfect. The sun was out, the air was fresh, and the cabin itself was everything we needed. The interior was basic, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a couple of bedrooms. We spent the day outside, hiking a nearby trail and sitting by a small creek that ran just behind the cabin. It was peaceful, too peaceful, the kind of peace that, in hindsight, feels like a warning. When the sun dipped below the horizon, we made our way back to the cabin. The woods had taken on a different feel as darkness settled in, with shadows stretching long and trees creaking in the breeze. We lit a fire outside, cooked some simple food, and shared stories. It was all very relaxing until the wind picked up. At first, it was just a gust here and there, but soon it grew stronger, the kind of wind that makes the trees sway, their branches scraping together. It was unsettling, but we didn't think much of it. We were used to the occasional storm. By the time the fire had burned low, the wind was howling. We could hear the branches snapping, the sound almost like something trying to push through the trees. I remember glancing up at the sky. The stars were barely visible behind the thick clouds that had rolled in. It wasn't supposed to rain, but it sure looked like it was about to. We decided to head inside for the night. The fire inside was still going, and the warmth from it made the cabin feel safe, like a little bubble isolated from whatever was happening outside. We pulled the curtains shut and gathered around the table, playing cards and telling more stories. Everyone was in good spirits, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the wind would suddenly stop, only to start up again louder than before, or the strange sounds coming from the woods. Around midnight, I went to the bathroom. The cabin was small, so the bathroom was just a few steps from the living room. I remember the silence when I opened the door. It was odd. The wind had died down completely, and the normal forest sounds had stopped as well. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I finished up and stepped back into the living room. That's when I noticed it. There was a noise coming from outside, a faint tapping sound, almost like something, or someone, was gently hitting the cabin's walls. I paused, trying to figure out if it was just the wind, but the tapping didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it seemed to come from somewhere near the window. I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain just a little. My breath caught in my throat. There was nothing there, just darkness. But I could feel it, that unmistakable feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned to the others, but they were all busy with their cards, completely unaware of what I just heard. I decided to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I sat back down, I couldn't shake the feeling. The tapping had stopped, but the silence felt heavier now. The fire crackled loudly in the corner, but even that noise seemed out of place in the stillness. As the hours passed, the uneasy feeling grew. I found myself glancing at the windows every few minutes, half expecting to see something move in the shadows. At one point, I thought I saw a figure pass by the window, but when I looked again, nothing was there. I was just tired, I told myself, a little jumpy from the long drive and the isolation of the woods. Eventually, we all settled down to sleep. I took the first bedroom with one of my friends, the others took the second. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I tried to focus on that, on how nice it was to be away from everything for a few days. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things. The creaking of the cabin, the sound of wind stirring outside, the occasional thump that I couldn't explain. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure what had woken me. Maybe it was a noise, or maybe it was just the feeling that something wasn't right. My heart was pounding in my chest. I lay still in the dark, straining my ears to listen. There it was again, the same tapping sound, but now it was coming from the roof. It was slow at first, almost like something was dragging across the wood. Then it picked up speed, a steady rhythm that seemed to grow louder and more urgent. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to get up. I quietly slid out of bed, careful not to wake my friend, and crept toward the window. Peered out, my pulse racing. Nothing. The tapping had stopped. But as I stood there, staring into the darkness, I noticed something else. Footprints. They were faint, but they were there, leading away from the cabin toward the woods. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced through all sorts of possibilities. Someone from a nearby cabin, maybe, or some sort of animal. But nothing about the situation felt normal. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come. The wind picked up again, howling outside the walls of the cabin. It seemed to rattle the windows, as if it were trying to break through. When morning came, I was the first to get up. The others were still asleep, and I didn't want to wake them yet. I made my way to the kitchen and brewed some coffee, trying to calm my nerves. I knew I had to tell the others about what had happened, but part of me hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if I had imagined it all? But another part of me knew that something wasn't right. I went outside to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The cabin was surrounded by dense woods on all sides, with a small clearing out front. The air was cold, the ground still damp from the night before. As I walked around the cabin, I stopped dead in my tracks. The footprints, they were clearer now, and they weren't from an animal. They were too big, too wide to belong to anything local. And they led directly to the back of the cabin, where there was nothing but thick trees and a steep slope leading down to a ravine. I felt a pit form in my stomach. I went back inside and woke the others, telling them what I'd seen. They didn't take me seriously at first. One of them suggested it was probably just an animal, a bear or something, but I wasn't convinced. We decided to check out the area together, but when we went outside, the footprints were gone. The ground was smooth again, as if nothing had been there at all. We spent the rest of the day trying to distract ourselves. We hiked a different trail, cooked some food, and tried to enjoy the rest of our time there. But the feeling of unease never really left. As the sun began to set again, I found myself staring into the woods, half expecting to see something watching us. That night, we locked the doors and windows, but sleep was elusive. The tapping didn't come back, but the air outside felt thick with tension. Around 4 a.m., I heard a loud crash. I bolted upright in bed, heart hammering. I waited for a moment, listening. The others were awake too now, and we all stood in the living room, staring at each other in the dark. There was no wind now, no rain, just silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving around outside. I grabbed the flashlight and we made our way to the door. We had no weapons, no way to defend ourselves. All we had were our instincts, and they were telling us to leave. We didn't know who or what was out there, but we weren't sticking around to find out. We packed up as quickly as we could, grabbing what we could carry, and left the cabin without another word. We didn't look back as we drove down the winding road, away from the woods, away from whatever had been out there. It wasn't until we were safely back in the city that I could finally breathe again. It was a trip I'd never forget, but not for the reasons I had hoped. I still don't know what was out there, and I don't think I ever want to find out. But I do know one thing. Sometimes the woods aren't as empty as they seem, and sometimes the things you hear at night are things you can't explain. I've always enjoyed the quiet of being alone in the woods. My cabin is tucked away in a small patch of forest, far from town, miles from the nearest neighbor. It's simple, just a wooden structure with a slanted roof and a porch that faces the trees. The kind of place where you can hear nothing but the wind and the occasional rustle of wildlife moving through the brush. I had built it myself, piece by piece, over the past few years, and it had become a sanctuary. The solitude was peaceful, but that night, the peace was shattered. Started out like any other evening. I'd spent the day cutting firewood and getting the cabin ready for the cold weather. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I gathered some dry wood and started the fire inside the cabin, letting the warmth spread through the space. The crackle of the flames and the smell of the burning would made everything feel right. I didn't plan on doing much that night, just a little reading, some time to think. I shut the door behind me as I stepped outside for a moment. The crisp air hit me, fresh and cool. The stars were already out, dotting the sky in a clear night. It was quiet, too quiet. There was no wind, no sounds of night animals. Just an eerie silence that made my skin crawl for no reason I could put my finger on. I shook it off, heading back inside, feeling a little foolish. After all, the woods were always quiet at night. I settled into my chair next to the fire, the heat of the flames casting dancing shadows across the room. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but the words blurred as I kept hearing the sound of something faint. Scratching, tapping, or maybe just the wind moving branches against the cabin. I stood up, walked to the window, and peered out into the darkness. Nothing. I couldn't see a thing in the blackness. The only light came from the soft glow of the fire inside, casting a faint outline around the edges of the trees. Everything seemed still, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. I checked the locks on the windows, double-checked the door, and then went back to the fire, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. The noise came again. This time it was clearer. A soft scratching, almost rhythmic, coming from outside, near the side of the cabin. I hesitated. Could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or something else rummaging around. But there was something about the noise that didn't fit. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and moved toward the door. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the trees around the cabin. Everything seemed normal, no sign of anything out of place. I stood there for a moment, listening, trying to figure out if it was an animal or if it was something else. The scratching came again, louder this time. It wasn't just scraping against the wood. It sounded like something was trying to get in. I froze. I wasn't someone who usually panicked, but this was different. I had lived alone out here for years, and I knew the wildlife, the sounds. This wasn't one of them. It was too purposeful. The noise came again, and I took a few slow steps toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no gun, no real defense. Just my flashlight, my instincts, and a whole lot of fear. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. I took a deep breath and stepped outside. My boots crunched against the dry leaves, the only sound in the otherwise still night. I turned the corner of the cabin, shining the light along the wall. First, I saw nothing. Then, I noticed something. A small trail of disturbed dirt near the base of the cabin, almost like someone had been there recently, moving along the foundation. I crouched down, running my hand along the ground. It was fresh. My heart sped up. Someone had been here, and not just anyone. Someone had been deliberately trying to get inside. The scratches on the wood were deep, like they had been made by something heavier than a small animal. The only thing heavier than that would be a person. I stood up quickly, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was a hunter or someone passing through. But that didn't explain why they hadn't left when they saw the light. They were still out there, watching. I moved back around the cabin, keeping my flashlight moving in every direction. Nothing. The woods were still. Too still. The only sounds were the beating of my own heart and my breath, harsh in the cold air. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling from the trees, like someone or something was moving just outside the edge of the light. It was slow at first, almost cautious, then quicker, like whatever it was getting closer. My grip on the flashlight tightened. I was alone in the woods, miles from anyone, and someone was moving around my cabin. I took a step back, then another, until I was back inside. I locked the door, turned off the porch light, and pulled the curtains closed. I tried to steady myself, to think. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just some random animal. I could feel it in my gut. The hours dragged on in a blur of tense silence. The scratching came again. It was louder now, more insistent, almost frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way in. I paced around the cabin, checking the locks, checking the windows. I couldn't sit still, couldn't breathe. Then it stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. No noise at all. No scratching. No rustling. Just the crackling of the fire and the steady tick of the clock on the wall. I moved to the window again, peering out into the night. Nothing. I exhaled, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. Something was wrong. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe it was minutes, maybe hours. But as I sat in the dim light of the fire, I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching across the leaves outside the cabin. Slowly, carefully, getting closer. I grabbed the flashlight and pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath. The light flicked on. My eyes scanned the darkness outside, my pulse racing. And then I saw it. A figure in the shadows, standing just at the edge of the trees. A man. Or at least it looked like a man, but something about him didn't sit right. He was tall, his silhouette sharp against the darkness. He stood motionless for a few seconds, just watching. Then he moved, slowly, deliberately, closer to the cabin. Panic surged through me. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and bolted for the back door. I didn't look back. I ran through the woods, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder, faster, ignoring the branches that scraped against my skin. My heart thudded in my chest, the sound of my breath loud in my ears. The cabin was fading behind me, but I didn't care. I just needed to get to the road, to get away from whatever was out there. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like an eternity, my mind fogged with fear and adrenaline. When I finally reached the road, I didn't stop. I kept going, my feet pounding against the dirt, not even daring to glance back until I reached the safety of a neighbor's house a few miles down the road. I'm safe now, but every time I think about going back, I can't shake the image of that figure in the woods. The fear lingers in me, the sound of footsteps still echoing in my mind. I haven't returned to the cabin. I don't know if I ever will, but there's one thing I know for sure. The woods aren't as quiet as they used to be. It was early fall when I found myself alone in a small, rented cabin deep in the woods. I had been looking forward to this weekend for a while. Time away from the hustle, away from the constant noise of the city. The cabin was far off the beaten path, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense trees. The kind of place where the silence was thick, where even the wind had trouble making a sound. It had seemed perfect, an escape from everything. I drove in on a Friday evening, the sun already beginning to dip behind the mountains as I parked the car near the cabin. The place looked like something out of a picture book, wooden with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney. It didn't have electricity, so I had brought some candles and a small battery-powered lantern. The only light came from the fading sun and a few stars peeking through the trees. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs as I unloaded my things. I wasn't exactly alone. I had my dog with me, a large, golden retriever named Max. He was a good companion, loyal and protective, though I knew this trip would be a test for both of us. The cabin had a single room with a small kitchen, a dining table, and a wood stove in the corner. A small staircase led to a loft where the bed was. It looked rustic, with wooden beams and an old-fashioned stone fireplace. I liked it instantly, though there was a certain feeling in the air that made my skin prickle. Max seemed to sense it, too. He trotted inside and immediately began sniffing around, his nose twitching at the air, his ears perked up. I assumed it was just the unfamiliar smells of the forest, so I didn't think much of it. I unpacked, lit the lantern, and got a fire going in the stove. The warmth spread quickly through the small cabin, and I felt a little more comfortable. The wind outside began to pick up, and I pulled the blanket from the bed to the couch, settled in, and opened a book. The evening passed slowly. I made myself some dinner, nothing fancy, just canned soup and crackers. Max curled up at my feet as I ate, occasionally lifting his head to look out the window, as if something outside had caught his attention. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just the kind of place where your mind starts to wander. I was used to hearing strange noises in the woods back home, and out here I expected it to be the same. I figured the wind was causing the occasional creak of the cabin, and the rustling of leaves outside was just nature doing its thing. Night fully descended, and with it came complete darkness. The only light came from the fire and the flickering lantern, which I had placed on the table near the window. The wind outside howled a little louder now, and the occasional branch scraping against the roof added a layer of unease. Max, who had been quietly dozing, suddenly lifted his head and started growling low in his throat. His body tensed, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for something. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. There was no reason for him to act like this. I had been outside earlier and didn't notice anything unusual. The forest was quiet, but now there was a feeling, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the wind. I tried to calm Max, but he wouldn't settle down. His growling became more intense, more persistent, and it was starting to freak me out. I looked out the window, trying to peer into the darkness. Nothing but trees. Then I heard it, a sound, faint at first, like something scraping against the cabin's walls. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It came again, and this time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. Something was outside. I grabbed the lantern, held it tightly, and slowly made my way to the door, Max at my heels. The night was nearly pitch black. The firelight from the cabin didn't reach far beyond the porch, and the trees loomed over us like dark giants. I stepped cautiously onto the porch, the wood creaking under my feet. Max stayed close, his head low, still growling. I scanned the woods, my mind racing. There was nothing, just the sound of the wind moving through the branches. Then I saw it. A shadow moved, just at the edge of the trees. It was large, but it didn't seem to be a bear or anything I could easily recognize. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was too dark to make out details, but the movement was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. Max barked suddenly, a sharp, loud noise that echoed through the trees. The shadow stopped moving, and for a moment, everything was still. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to move, too scared to look away from the dark patch of forest where I had seen the movement. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. Max whined, his tail between his legs, and I stepped back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my breath coming in quick gasps. What the hell was that? I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but the sound, the movement, felt wrong. I sat back down by the fire, trying to distract myself, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Every small noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the cabin, and every movement in the trees made me jump. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something was off. Max refused to leave my side, and his constant vigilance kept me on edge. After a while, I decided to call it a night. I climbed up to the loft, my body still tense, and tried to sleep. But the fear didn't let up. The wind howled outside, and every creak of the cabin seemed louder than before. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a mistake coming out here. Hours passed. The wind seemed to die down, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I drifted in and out of a restless sleep, every small sound pulling me back into wakefulness. At some point during the night, I woke up to Max's soft whining. I sat up, trying to see if anything was amiss. The cabin was completely silent, too silent. Then I heard it again, the scraping sound. It was closer now. I reached for the lantern, my heart racing as I carefully made my way downstairs. Max was already by the door, his eyes wide and alert. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the darkness. The wind had completely died down now, and the forest was eerily still. I listened closely, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. I stepped outside, Max at my heels, and looked around. The moon was hidden behind the trees, leaving the forest in complete darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the cabin behind me. As I stood there, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, heavy and suffocating. And then I saw it. Again, just at the edge of the trees, a shape moving slowly between the trunks. But this time I was closer. I could make out a figure tall and hunched like a man, but not quite. It moved unnaturally, as if it didn't quite belong in the world of the living. I slammed the door shut and locked it again. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my mind raced. I could feel the presence outside, the thing watching me, waiting. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was dangerous. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, jumping at every little noise. Max refused to sleep, his eyes constantly darting to the windows, his body tense. I couldn't get any rest. The morning seemed to take forever to arrive. When dawn finally broke, I was relieved. The first light of morning felt like a blessing, and the air seemed lighter, as though the night had lifted its weight from the cabin. I carefully opened the door and stepped outside. The woods were peaceful, the birds chirping in the distance, the light spilling through the trees in a way that made everything look normal again. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. There were no signs of any strange figure, no footprints in the dirt. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up my things quickly, not even bothering to cook breakfast. Max was already at the car, ready to go. I didn't need to stay another minute. I didn't want to stay another minute. As I drove away from the cabin, the trees closing in around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods. That something or someone had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I didn't want to think about it, but I couldn't forget the feeling of those eyes on me, the sense that something had been just out of sight, always there. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I realized something. I had never heard the wind again that night. It was early autumn when I decided to take a solo trip to a small cabin I had rented deep in the woods. The kind of cabin you find in the middle of nowhere, isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional sound of wildlife. It was the perfect getaway. After weeks of working non-stop, I needed the silence, the solitude. No one to bother me, no responsibilities, just time to think and relax. The cabin itself was old but well kept, with a stone chimney and a large front porch. It was surrounded by a thick forest that, at first glance, looked beautiful and peaceful. There were no other cabins nearby, no road signs, and no indication of civilization for miles. Just trees, the occasional animal, and the soft rustling of leaves. When I arrived, the sun was just starting to dip below the horizon. The air had that crispness to it that comes only with fall, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves, sending them skittering across the ground. I unloaded my bags and walked inside. The place smelled of pine and wood smoke. It had a cozy, lived-in feel. There was a fireplace in the main room with a few logs stacked neatly beside it, and the furniture, though old, was comfortable enough. After a while, I built a small fire and sat down with a book, letting the warmth of the flames slowly melt away the tension of my long drive. The cabin felt good. It felt like the perfect place to disconnect from everything. There was no cell service and no Wi-Fi, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, I was ready to go to bed. I was tired from the drive and the excitement of finally being out here. The bed was simple, a thick quilt covering a sturdy frame. I got in, pulled the quilt up around me, and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace. But sleep didn't come as easily as I thought it would. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Nothing unusual. The wind had died down, so there was an eerie stillness in the air, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. But then, I heard something else. A tapping sound, faint but distinct, came from the side of the cabin, near the window. I froze, my mind racing. My first thought was that it could be a branch brushing against the cabin, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I lay still for a moment, straining to listen. The tapping continued, soft but persistent. It wasn't loud enough to be anything large, like an animal, but it was close, too close. My heart began to pound. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but the feeling of unease started to creep in. I pulled the quilt tighter around me, hoping it was just my imagination, hoping that when I checked in the morning, everything would be fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Something about the silence of the night, the way the tapping seemed to echo in the stillness, it didn't sit right. I decided to get up and investigate, despite the discomfort gnawing at me. Slowly, I slipped out of bed and padded across the floor in my socks, trying not to make any noise. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter, clicked it on, and shone it through the window. Nothing. The area outside was dark. Nothing moved. I took a deep breath, half relieved, half disappointed. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe I was just paranoid. But then, as I turned away from the window to head back to bed, I heard the tapping again. This time it was louder, more insistent. My stomach dropped. I walked cautiously to the door, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness in front of me. I stood there for a moment, listening intently. No more tapping, but something felt off. There was a strange feeling in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. I checked the locks on the door, double-checked the windows. Everything seemed secure, but still I felt exposed, alone. That gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach was hard to ignore. I went back to bed, pulling the quilt up over my head, trying to block out the thoughts that kept swirling in my mind. The fire had died down, and the cabin felt colder now, the quiet unnerving in its completeness. For the first time, I regretted coming here alone. I tried to sleep, but sleep was elusive. The tapping didn't stop, continued, steady, rhythmic. Each tap was like a beat of my heart, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was in my head, echoing through my skull. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, the sun was creeping through the cracks in the curtains, the soft light of dawn filtering into the cabin. I woke with a start, my heart still racing from the events of the night. The tapping was gone, replaced by the chirping of birds outside, the morning sounds of the forest waking up. I got up, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of unease. I made some coffee and ate a quick breakfast, hoping to calm my nerves. But as I sat there, staring out the window at the peaceful woods, I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. I decided to take a walk, to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. The air was cool, the ground still damp with the morning dew. As I walked, I tried to push the events of the night out of my mind. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, and the trail seemed to stretch on forever. I passed the old, gnarled trees, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, but the beauty of it was overshadowed by the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. There were tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, but human tracks. Small, almost delicate footprints, as though someone had been walking through the woods barefoot. They were fresh, too, the edges still sharp from the recent rain. I followed the tracks for a while, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the more uneasy I became. The tracks led me to a small clearing, and as I stepped into it, I froze. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a small pile of rocks, carefully stacked. It wasn't just a random pile either. It looked like it had been arranged deliberately, the stones placed one on top of the other in a way that felt intentional. I felt my pulse quicken. There was something unsettling about the sight of it, something off. It wasn't just a pile of rocks. It felt like a marker, like a warning. And then it hit me, the tapping. It was as if the tapping had been calling me here, leading me to this exact spot. I turned to leave, my instincts telling me to get back to the cabin. But as I did, I heard something behind me, a rustling in the bushes. I froze, my body stiffening. I turned, shining the flashlight into the brush. But there was nothing, only the soft wind, the rustle of leaves. I quickly made my way back to the cabin, my mind racing. By the time I arrived, I could feel my heart still pounding in my chest. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The tracks, the pile of rocks, the tapping. It wasn't just coincidence. Couldn't be. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The tapping returned, louder than before, as if it was mocking me. I could feel the presence of something or someone outside waiting. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't know what had been out there, what had been tapping on my cabin, or what the tracks and the pile of rocks meant. But I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I'd been wanting to get out of the city for a while. Too much noise, too many people, and everything always felt rushed. The idea of being alone somewhere quiet had been floating around in my head for months. I didn't need luxury or anything fancy, just space, quiet, maybe trees. I didn't really know what I was looking for, but I'd know it when I saw it. I ended up finding an old cabin listed for rent on some outdated-looking website. It was cheap and simple. One room with a bed, a fireplace, a table, and an old gas stove. It was about 4 hours from where I lived, near a lake I'd never heard of, and it had no internet or cell service. It was exactly what I wanted. I packed light, just a duffel bag with clothes, some food, a flashlight, a few books, and a first aid kit. I made sure to grab a backup battery-powered lantern and some extra water, even though the listing said there was a well pump outside. I filled up my car the night before and left just after sunrise. The drive was long but easy. The last part was on a narrow, gravel road that wound through dense forest. I only passed one other vehicle, an old pickup heading in the opposite direction. The further I went, the more isolated everything felt. The trees pressed in on both sides of the road, and the sun filtered down in patches. I didn't see any other cabins or houses, not even mailboxes. I finally pulled up to the cabin around 2 p.m. It looked older than the pictures showed. The paint on the wooden siding was peeling, and some of the shutters hung crooked. The porch had a few loose boards, and the steps creaked under my weight. Still, it wasn't falling apart. It looked lived in, or at least like someone had kept it from rotting completely. I unlocked the door with the key the owner mailed me and stepped inside. The place smelled like old wood and dust. The air was cool and a little damp, like it hadn't been opened up in a while. I dropped my bag on the bed and walked through the space. It really was just one room. The bed sat in the back corner, next to a narrow window that looked out toward the forest. The table was small, pushed against the wall near the fireplace. A few old chairs leaned around it. None of them matched. The stove looked like it hadn't been lit in years, and the fridge was one of those tiny ones, probably only good for drinks. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse behind the cabin, which I checked out right away to make sure it was usable. It was. After I unpacked a bit, I sat on the front porch with a bottle of water and just listened. No traffic, no sirens, no voices. Just birds, the wind in the trees, and the occasional crack of a branch falling somewhere deeper in the woods. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been holding myself together until I let go of all that background noise. Felt good. I figured I'd spend a few days here, maybe a week, hike around, read, sleep in. No schedule, no pressure. The first day passed quietly. I made a simple dinner on the gas stove, beans and rice, nothing fancy, and watched the sunset through the trees. It got dark fast. I lit a few candles and turned on the lantern, placing it in the middle of the table. Outside, the forest turned completely black, like someone had pulled a curtain around the cabin. I stayed up reading for a while before heading to bed. The silence at night was almost overwhelming. I could hear everything. The creaks of the cabin settling, the rustle of leaves, even my own breathing. I kept the lantern on low by the bed just to feel a little less swallowed up by the dark. I woke up sometime in the night to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again, crunching like footsteps on gravel. The porch. I froze. I listened hard, holding my breath. Nothing. No more sounds, just the wind. I told myself it was probably an animal. A raccoon maybe, or a deer walking past. I didn't get up. I didn't want to look out the window and see something I didn't want to see. I just stayed still until I drifted back to sleep. The next morning was clear and cold. I made coffee on the stove and ate some granola. I walked down the trail behind the cabin that led toward the lake. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but it was easy enough to follow. The trees opened up after a while, and I reached the edge of the lake. It was beautiful, smooth, still water reflecting the sky, with reeds along the shore and dragonflies flitting around. I sat on a fallen log and just stared out at it for a long time. No boats, no people, just quiet. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The doormat had been moved. It wasn't much, just shifted to the side a little, but I knew I hadn't touched it that morning. I brushed it off. Maybe I kicked it without noticing. Maybe the wind moved it. I tried not to think about it. That night, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, this time slower, more deliberate. I was already in bed, half asleep, when I heard it, creaking on the porch. Then silence. I sat up and grabbed the lantern, turning the light up. I didn't want to go outside. My heart was pounding, and my throat was dry. I waited. Still nothing. I got up slowly and walked to the window, pushing the curtain aside just a bit. The porch was empty, or at least I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the porch. They were faint, but they were there. Not animal tracks, shoes, maybe boots. I followed them for a bit. They came from the woods, stopped near the porch, then circled around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the trees again. I stood there for a long time, staring at where they vanished. I wasn't sure what to do. I hadn't seen anyone. I didn't have cell service. There wasn't a ranger station nearby, and I hadn't passed any houses. I didn't even know if it was trespassing out here. Maybe someone lived nearby and was just curious, but it didn't feel like that. I locked the door when I went inside. The windows didn't have locks, which made me nervous. I kept the lantern and flashlight next to my bed. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing things. Branches snapping, rustling leaves, the creak of the porch again. I told myself it was animals. It had to be. There were lots of deer out here. Maybe a bear, even. But that didn't explain the footprints. On the fourth night, I woke up to a sound that was different. Not outside. Inside. A floorboard creaked. Not the wind, not an animal. Inside. My chest went tight, and I sat up, not even breathing. I reached for the lantern and turned it on. The cabin looked normal, quiet, empty, but I felt it. That cold, crawling feeling on the back of my neck. I got out of bed slowly, flashlight in hand. I checked the door. Still locked. I checked the windows. None of them looked open. I looked under the bed, behind the table, even inside the fireplace. Nothing. No one. But I knew something had changed. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat at the table with the lantern on full brightness, just listening, waiting. I wanted morning to come so badly it hurt. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bag. I'd only planned to stay a few more days, but I didn't want to be there anymore. I was tired, paranoid, and something didn't feel right. I walked around the cabin one more time before I left. That's when I saw the marks on the back window. Scratches. Thin, almost like from a knife or key. Long, looping scratches, as if someone had traced shapes into the glass over and over. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen them before. They were fresh. I didn't bother cleaning up. I threw my bag in the car and started driving. The gravel road felt longer on the way out. The trees were too close. I kept looking in the rearview mirror like I expected to see someone standing in the road behind me. I didn't relax until I hit pavement and got a couple bars of cell service. Later, when I got home, I emailed the owner of the cabin. I told him I left early and didn't feel safe there. He responded a day later, apologizing and saying no one else was supposed to be in the area. He didn't offer a refund or anything, just said he'd check in with the local caretaker next time he was up that way. That was it. Weeks went by. I tried not to think about it, but sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and hear creaking sounds in my apartment. Sometimes I'd glance at the window and think I saw something move outside, even though I lived on the second floor. A month after I got back, I got a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photo, a picture of the cabin, taken at night. From outside, the window near the bed was lit up. In the photo, I could see myself, asleep under the blanket. The photo had been taken from maybe 20 feet away, just far enough that I hadn't noticed anyone there. I moved the next week. Didn't tell anyone where I was going. I changed my number. I don't go to remote places anymore. I still like the quiet, but now I make sure I can see the neighbors. I make sure there's a lock on every door and that my phone works, even in the middle of the night. I never found out who took the photo. I never went back to the cabin. I don't plan. I booked the cabin because I needed to get away from everything. My job had been burning me out, and the city noise made it hard to sleep at night. A friend had stayed at this place in northern Minnesota a few years ago and said it was peaceful, remote, and perfect for a reset. He wasn't wrong. The drive up took most of the day, winding through stretches of highway, then onto narrow forest roads that seemed untouched for years. My phone signal dropped about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin, which felt like a good sign. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. The cabin sat on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by thick pine forest. It was late November, and snow had fallen recently. Not deep enough to make walking hard, but enough to cover the ground and silence every step. There was a wide porch out front with 2 rocking chairs and a bench. The place looked older than I expected, but it was sturdy. The kind of place you'd expect a hunter or a fisherman to keep up in the woods. Inside, it was simple. A small kitchen, a living room with a wood stove, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom that worked off a water tank system. The air inside smelled like old pine and smoke. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean. I unpacked, set up some firewood, and made myself a cup of coffee while watching the sun drop behind the tree line. It got dark fast out there, faster than I was used to. By 5:30, it was already night. That first night, I didn't do much. Just read, sat by the fire, and listened to the wind pressing against the cabin walls. I went to sleep early, with the feeling of being wrapped in a thick blanket of quiet. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Cold light filled the cabin as the sky started to brighten. I stepped outside with my coffee, boots crunching in the thin snow. The lake was completely frozen. Not smooth, but white with wind-blown snow and ridges in the ice. I saw a few deer tracks coming from the woods toward the lake, and then turning away. Felt good to be out there, disconnected. The second day went by slow, but in a good way. I walked a bit down the shore, keeping to the tree line. I had a pair of binoculars and spotted a bald eagle out on the lake, probably hunting for fish that got trapped under the ice. I cooked a simple meal, played some music from a battery-powered speaker, and read until the sun dipped again. That night was colder. I had to wake up around 2 a.m. to feed the fire. When I stepped outside to grab more wood, I noticed something strange. There were paw prints in the snow that hadn't been there earlier. Not deer, not rabbit. Dog prints. Large ones, and only one set. They started from the tree line about 30 feet away and came right up to the porch, then circled back. They were fresh. The snow hadn't filled them in yet, and they sat clearly on top of the light dusting from earlier in the evening. I hadn't heard anything, and I hadn't seen any other cabins or signs of people on the drive-in. I stood still for a while, holding the wood in my arms, trying to listen for anything in the woods. Nothing. No crunching, no movement. Just that deep, empty silence you only get in places far from roads and towns. I brought the wood in and locked the door, then double-checked all the windows. I sat in the chair by the fire and watched the flames until I drifted off again. In the morning, the tracks were still there, and more had joined them. Still just one set, but they'd come back. They followed the edge of the porch this time, as if something had been circling it slowly, pacing. I walked out into the yard, following the prints toward the trees. They stopped about 20 feet in and then just vanished. No return path, no deeper prints heading off somewhere else. Just stopped. It bothered me. Animals don't usually walk in, stop, and vanish without leaving more of a trail. I brushed it off, maybe the wind or snow had covered the rest. But it sat in the back of my mind the rest of the day. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself. Went on a longer hike into the woods, carried a flare and a knife just in case, even though I wasn't too worried about wildlife. I didn't see anything except a squirrel and some birds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I'd stop walking and listen. Nothing but wind, yet I kept feeling like I wasn't alone out there. When I got back to the cabin, I scanned the treeline again. Nothing moved. I made dinner and decided to stay up late. Maybe wear myself out so I'd sleep through the night. I kept the fire going, wrote in a small notebook I'd brought with me, and read under the yellow glow of a lantern. Around midnight, I heard something. It was soft at first, like a shuffle on snow, a small scraping sound. I turned off the lantern and let my eyes adjust. I sat still, barely breathing, ears straining. Came again from the porch. I moved slowly to the window beside the door and pulled the curtain back just enough to see out. Something was sitting on the porch. It was a dog, but something about it wasn't right. Its body was low to the ground, legs stiff and oddly angled. The fur was patchy, like it had mange, and dark but thin enough in places to show pale skin underneath. Its head was large, but the muzzle was short, almost like it had been flattened, and its eyes reflected yellow in the moonlight, but not in the way a normal dog's would. They didn't shine, they glowed. It wasn't moving, just sitting facing the door, like it was waiting. I stayed frozen. I didn't want to move, didn't want to startle it. I watched it for what felt like half an hour. It didn't lay down. It didn't sniff around. Just sat there, still as a statue. Eventually, I backed away and stayed on the floor, away from the windows. I didn't hear it leave. I stayed awake until morning. When I finally stepped outside after the sun came up, the prints were all over. Around the porch, by the firewood stack, even by the side window of the bedroom. It had moved in the night, even if I hadn't heard it. The weirdest part was that there were no markings near the trees this time. No tracks leading in or out, just the ones around the cabin. I considered leaving that day, packing up and heading home early. But I told myself it was just a sick stray, maybe from someone else's cabin farther out. It was a big forest, and animals acted strange when they were starving or had been hurt. That evening, I built up the fire early and blocked the windows with extra blankets I'd found in the closet. I kept my knife nearby and my boots close to the bed. I left a lantern on low all night. At some point past midnight, I woke up because I felt like something was near me, not touching me but close. The room was cold. The fire had burned down. I sat up slowly and listened. I could hear breathing. It wasn't mine. It was deep, slow, like an exhale through a half-clogged nose. It was right outside the window, just behind the wall. I held still, heart hammering in my chest. It kept going, long breaths, almost like it was sniffing the wall. Then it stopped. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear movement, just silence again. In the morning, I found new tracks. This time, they went farther, around the back of the cabin near the outhouse, then toward the shed that held tools and extra propane. I opened the shed carefully. Nothing was inside except the gear, but scratched into the wooden door, just at eye level, were long marks. Not claw marks exactly, but more like scrapes. Deep ones, 5 of them unevenly spaced, like a hand with long nails had dragged across it. The prints were heavier here, like it had been standing still, shifting its weight. I backed away and shut the shed, locking it. The air felt different that day, not just cold but wrong, like the kind of pressure you feel before a bad storm. I sat inside most of the day, rifle across my lap now. I hadn't planned on needing it, but I was glad I brought it. That night I didn't sleep. At around 3 a.m., I heard the front door creak, just a little, like pressure against it, then a thump. Not hard, not like something trying to break in, just a slow push. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the door, gun in hand. It didn't open. The noise stopped. I didn't go near the window this time. In the morning, I found smudges on the glass. Not paw prints, smears like something wet had pressed against it. That was it. I wasn't going to wait for something worse. I packed everything I could into the truck and left that day. Didn't bother cleaning up, didn't leave a note. Just drove until I had cell service again and then kept driving until I was home. I reported it to the property manager. Told them I thought there was a stray dog out there that might be dangerous. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I never heard back, and I never asked. It's been almost a year now. I still think about it. Not every day, but sometimes. Usually late at night when it's too quiet. When I step outside for air and think I see something shift in the dark. When I hear breathing that isn't mine, just for a second. I don't go to remote cabins anymore. I don't camp alone. I keep my porch lights on all night. And I've never seen another dog that looks like that one. Not on the street. Not in any book. Not in any search I've done online. Whatever it was, it was. I needed a break from people. Too much noise, too many eyes, too much constant interaction. Work was draining, social stuff was draining. Even walking through the city made me feel like I was constantly being watched or pushed around by crowds. I'd always liked being alone in the woods. There was something calming about it. No phones, no emails, no cars, no people. Just trees, wind, and the sound of leaves brushing against each other like quiet whispers. So I rented a cabin. It wasn't fancy. I found it listed online through a guy who didn't even use a proper rental site. Just pictures on a blog and a number to call. It was about 4 hours outside the city, deep in a mountain range where paved roads turned into dirt tracks and then into narrow paths barely wide enough for my car. The guy had said it used to belong to his grandfather. It looked like it hadn't changed much since the 60s. The pictures showed a tiny wooden building with a mossy roof, a crooked chimney, and no neighbors for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I arrived just before sunset. The last few miles of the road were rough, washed out in places, steep in others. I had to park a few hundred feet from the cabin and carry my stuff through the trees. The cabin sat on a small rise, surrounded by tall pine and birch trees, the kind that stay quiet even when the wind blows. I had a heavy backpack, a cooler of food, some firewood, and a few tools. I wasn't planning to do anything fancy. Just hike, read, maybe sketch a little, maybe cook some simple meals. I was planning to be there for 4 days. The place was smaller than I thought. One room, a wood stove in the corner, an old cot with a thin mattress, a table and 2 chairs, a tiny kitchen area with a sink that didn't work unless you manually poured in water from a big jug. No electricity, just oil lamps, no cell service either. There was an outhouse about 50 feet out back, behind a clump of trees. I felt good. The quiet hit me like a blanket. The air was cool and clean. I could hear birds and insects, the rustling of small animals. I unpacked slowly, lit a lamp, opened the small shuttered window to let in the air. I made a sandwich and sat out on the little porch with it, looking at the forest stretching out in every direction. The sun dropped behind the trees, and the blue twilight settled in. There were no stars yet, just a pale sky. I sat out there until the bugs got too annoying, then went inside, shut the door, and got ready for bed. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times because the wind picked up and made the trees creak. At one point, something knocked over the small metal trash bin I'd left outside, but I figured it was a raccoon or maybe a fox. I fell asleep again easily. The second day, I went hiking. I followed a trail behind the cabin that eventually faded out, and I made my own path after that, heading downhill into a small valley where I saw deer tracks and even what looked like bear scat. I didn't get too close. I turned back after about 4 hours, just in time to get back before dark. That night, I heard something again. It was about 2 or 3 a.m. I was awake already because the cot was terrible, and my back ached. I heard soft thumps outside. Not animal sounds, something heavier, more deliberate. I sat up slowly and listened. It came from the front side of the cabin, near the porch. I didn't have a flashlight, just a lamp, and I didn't want to light it because I didn't want whatever it was to see me moving around. I sat in the dark for almost 20 minutes, barely breathing. I couldn't see anything out the window. Eventually the sounds stopped. No more footsteps, just the usual forest night sounds. The next morning, I checked outside. The trash bin was knocked over again, but it was about 10 feet from where I'd left it. That was weird. Animals might knock it over, but they wouldn't carry it off like that. I looked around in the dirt and saw a few tracks. They didn't look like raccoon or deer. Too big, No claws either. They looked kind of like footprints, but wider, less defined. Just wide, oval depressions in the dirt. I felt a little uneasy, but told myself it was probably just a bear or something weird about the soil. I spent most of that day chopping firewood and reading. I didn't feel like hiking again. That night, I couldn't sleep. There was a weird feeling in the air. The trees weren't moving, the wind had stopped, and the forest was dead silent. Even bugs weren't buzzing, just silence. That kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Every shadow looked wrong. I felt like something was out there, standing just past where I could see. I closed the window and locked the door. Not that the lock would do much, it was just a flimsy latch. Then I heard something again, just after midnight. Footsteps, but faster this time. Not running, but quick, light steps circling the cabin. Not stomping like a person or thumping like a bear. More like pattering, quick taps on the dirt and dead leaves. Then it stopped. And then something tapped on the window. Not hard, just one tap, like the end of a stick hitting the glass. I held my breath. My heart felt like it was beating in my throat. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Just stared at the dark rectangle of the window, waiting to see something move. But nothing did. I stayed like that for at least an hour, frozen in bed. The next morning, I forced myself to go outside. Nothing was there. I circled the cabin. The tracks were back. Same as before, wide, shallow ovals. But now there were more of them. A line of them leading toward the trees and then doubling back. I followed them a little way, just past the tree line. Then I saw something I still don't understand. A deer, or what was left of one. It was lying on its side, maybe 30 feet from the trail. It wasn't eaten, not torn up, but its legs were twisted unnaturally, like they'd been bent the wrong way and then snapped. The neck was broken too, head twisted around backward. The eyes were open, no blood anywhere. I didn't stay long. I turned back and walked fast all the way to the cabin, heart racing, constantly looking behind me. That afternoon, I packed some of my stuff. I told myself it was just a precaution, but I didn't believe that. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. That evening, just before dark, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, breathing. It was coming from the trees. Long, steady breaths. Not human, not snorting or wheezing. Just slow inhales and exhales like something with big lungs. I froze near the window and tried to see it. Nothing. Just the trees, shadows, and the faint red glow of sunset. But the breathing got closer. I grabbed the hatchet I'd been using for firewood. I didn't have a gun, which I now realized was a mistake. The breathing circled the cabin once, slow and even, then faded away. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I went out again. No tracks this time. No dead animals. Nothing. The forest was loud again. Birds, insects, squirrels in the trees. It was like nothing had happened. But I knew better. I made a plan to leave early the next morning. I'd already been there 3 nights. One more day and I'd head out. The only reason I didn't leave that day was because I was afraid of hiking that trail with no daylight. Felt safer in the cabin. Even though I was starting to wonder if that was true. That final night was the worst. I stayed up with the lamp burning low, sitting at the table with the hatchet and a heavy stick beside me. I kept my boots on. My bag was packed. I was ready to run if I had to. It started just before midnight. A scratching sound. Not claws. Not nails. Something scraping lightly across the wood siding of the cabin. Like a branch, maybe, but there were no trees that close. Then I heard it again, lower down, near the base of the wall. A sliding, shuffling sound. Then silence. Then came the breathing again, right outside the window. I turned down the lamp and stayed low. I didn't move. The breathing stayed steady, long and slow. Then I saw it. A shape moved in front of the window. It was tall, not human tall, taller, but narrow. Its head brushed the top of the window frame. The outline was strange, arms too long, body too thin. The head turned slowly toward the glass. I dropped down behind the table and didn't look again. The breathing stayed there for a long time. I don't know how long. felt like forever. Then I heard footsteps, that same fast, light patter, circling the cabin. Twice. Then something tapped the window again. Then silence. I waited until sunrise before moving again. I stepped outside with the hatchet in one hand, my backpack over my shoulder. Everything was still. The forest looked normal again. Birds were chirping. The air was warm. No tracks. No breathing. No smell. Nothing. I walked away without looking back. I got to my car, threw my stuff in, and drove without stopping for hours. Back in the city, I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. The cabin was supposed to be a simple retreat, a weekend getaway. My friends and I had been looking forward to it for weeks, hoping for some time away from the grind of daily life. We rented the place from a small family who'd owned it for years, tucked in the woods near a lake, far away from any civilization. The pictures online made it seem like the perfect escape. Quiet, peaceful, surrounded by trees and water. A place where you could disconnect, relax, and just enjoy the solitude. We didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip low, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The cabin was exactly what we imagined, rustic but comfortable. The woods smelled faintly of pine, and the windows offered a stunning view of the lake, which shimmered like glass in the fading light. The air was crisp, cool for late spring, but pleasant enough to sit outside by the fire pit once it got dark. I had never been one to believe in anything supernatural, and the others in our group felt the same. Sure, we'd heard the local stories when we picked up the keys. Tales about strange sounds in the woods, odd occurrences, and rumors of someone disappearing once years ago. But we shrugged them off as just that, stories. The kind of things that get told to tourists to add some mystery. We joked about it, even dared each other to explore the woods at night, but deep down we didn't expect anything to happen. The first night went by without incident. We spent the evening sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about nothing important. Eventually, we headed inside to get some sleep. I wasn't tired, but the thought of lying in that cozy cabin with a book seemed better than staying out in the cold. As I lay in bed, I listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustling through the trees, the occasional call of an owl, and the soft ripple of the water at the lake's edge. It was all so peaceful, almost too peaceful. I found myself drifting off to sleep, the sense of calm washing over me. That was until I woke up. The clock on the nightstand showed 2:34 a.m. The cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the curtains. I shifted in bed, trying to get comfortable again, but then I heard it. A noise, a sound so soft at first, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming. Came from outside the cabin. A faint rustling, like something or someone was moving around. At first, I tried to dismiss it as the wind or some animal. We were in the woods, after all, and there were plenty of creatures out there. But the more I listened, the more it didn't sound like an animal. It wasn't the usual nighttime noises you hear from deer or raccoons. This was deliberate, slow, purposeful, like someone was walking around the perimeter of the cabin, just out of sight. My heart started to race. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. It seemed to be circling the cabin. Around the back, then the front, then the sides. Every few seconds it paused, and then started again. I wasn't sure what to make of it. My brain tried to reason with itself, telling me it was probably just the wind or some large animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I lay there in the darkness, waiting for the noise to stop, for the rational part of me to take over and calm my nerves. But it didn't stop. The longer it went on, the more uneasy I became. Then I heard it again. A faint thud, like something had bumped against the side of the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I was no longer willing to brush it off as nothing. The rustling grew louder. I knew it was getting closer. The figure, or whatever it was circling the cabin even faster now, like it was drawing nearer. The silence that had once been comforting now felt suffocating. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, like something out there was waiting for me to do something, to make a move. Then I heard something else, a soft scrape against the wood. It was slow, deliberate, like nails on a chalkboard. It sent a chill straight through me, and I froze. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure anyone could hear it, but there was no sound from my friends. They were all still asleep. I stayed in bed for what felt like hours, listening to whatever was moving around outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever it was out there wasn't just some curious animal, but something more, something with intent. Finally, just as I was about to gather the courage to get up and check, I heard a soft voice from the other side of the room. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was enough to make me hold my breath. My mind raced. Who could it be? One of the other guys. But why would they whisper in the middle of the night? The voice sounded different, though. Too low, too eerie. It was almost like it was trying to imitate someone, trying to sound like it belonged. It made me sick to my stomach. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just lie there and let it continue. I slowly pushed the covers off and slipped out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. I paused for a moment, just listening. The rustling outside had stopped, but the air felt thick, like something was just waiting to happen. I crept toward the window and peeked out, careful not to let the light spill too much outside. I couldn't see anything. The woods were quiet, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. As I stood there, trying to make sense of everything, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the trees, far in the distance. I quickly turned off the flashlight, holding my breath. It was too far to make out, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I couldn't stay in there. Whatever was out there, it was real, and it wasn't just going to go away. I had to warn the others. I stepped carefully over the floorboards, trying not to wake anyone, and made my way down the hall toward the others' rooms. The silence was unbearable. My skin prickled as I passed the bathroom, the door slightly ajar. That's when I heard it again, a faint tapping sound, like someone gently knocking on the wall. It came from the direction of the back door, and it sent a wave of nausea through me. I quickly reached the others' rooms and knocked quietly. No one answered. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. Everyone was still sound asleep, just like before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I made my way back to the living room and stood by the door. My hand was on the handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. I needed to be sure. Slowly, I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear anything. There was nothing. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the night, followed by a low growl, came from outside. Then, everything went completely still. My pulse raced. This wasn't the kind of noise I could explain away. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something bigger. I slowly turned the handle and opened the door a crack. The cold air hit me like a wall, but I didn't move. I listened. There was nothing. The woods were eerily silent, as though everything had suddenly frozen. Then I saw it. Just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and its outline was hard to make out, but it was definitely not human. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My legs were shaking, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for me to make the first move. After what seemed like an eternity, it finally turned and disappeared back into the woods. I waited, frozen, until I was sure it was gone. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep, didn't dare to. By morning, I told everyone what had happened, though none of them believed me at first. They thought I was imagining things, maybe just a product of the isolation and the weird sounds of the woods. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew something had been out there. The rest of the trip was uneventful. We packed up and left early the next morning, and I didn't look back. Even now, whenever I think about that night, I still don't know what that thing was. But I know one thing for sure, we weren't alone out there. Not by a long shot. I woke up to a strange noise coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch scraping against the roof, but the sound persisted. Something soft but dragging, almost like feet shuffling slowly across the dirt. I froze, not sure if I had imagined it. The cabin was small, tucked away in the woods, with nothing around for miles except trees, more trees, and the occasional animal trail. I had rented the place on a whim, looking for a quiet weekend away from the chaos of city life. A break, something peaceful. But now, with the noise outside, the isolation felt different. It felt heavier. I got out of bed and pulled on my boots, my eyes glued to the single window in the small room. The pale light of early morning barely cut through the trees, leaving the world outside looking like a dark, shrouded mess. The sounds kept coming, faint but consistent. I slowly moved to the door, unsure if I wanted to see what was out there, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and stepped out onto the small porch. The cold morning air hit me like a slap in the face, and I immediately regretted stepping outside. But there was no turning back now. The sound was closer, like something or someone was dragging itself across the ground. I turned the flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the yard. Nothing. The woods around the cabin were still, no movement except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, something caught my eye near the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, another trick of the dim light. But as I looked closer, I saw it. The figure crouched low to the ground. It looked strange, unnatural. The figure didn't look like a person. It had an odd, contorted shape, almost like it was too thin for its height. The skin was pale, sickly, almost translucent in the dim light, and its head, it was far too large for its body. The eyes, big, round, and wide, shone faintly in the dark, like they were reflecting the light from my flashlight. But the most disturbing part, it didn't move. It just sat there watching me. I stood frozen, too terrified to move, too scared to breathe. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The creature seemed almost peaceful, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the first move. I don't know how long we stood like that, just staring at each other. But when I finally blinked, it was gone, vanished. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had no idea what to do. I wanted to run back into the cabin, lock the door, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. I couldn't just ignore it. What the hell was that thing? I stepped closer to the trees, moving slowly, cautiously, shining the flashlight ahead of me. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. A few yards ahead of me, half hidden in the shadows, it was crouched again, like it had never moved. I almost turned and ran back to the cabin, but something stopped me. Something made me stay, made me look at the creature. It wasn't like I was drawn to it, but I couldn't look away either. My body was frozen in place, and my mind was a mess of confusion and fear. Then the creature made a sound. A low, wet gurgling noise, like it was trying to speak but couldn't. I flinched, the sound sending a wave of dread through me. I raised the flashlight higher, shining it directly at the creature. Its eyes glowed even brighter, reflecting the light, but it still didn't move. It didn't even flinch. I wanted to scream, to shout at it, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, unable to do anything but stare at the thing in front of me. But then, out of nowhere, it moved. Not quickly, not suddenly, but it shifted slightly, as if it had been waiting for me to make a decision. Its long, bony arms stretched out in front of it, dragging itself forward with that same strange, shuffling motion. My heart jumped into my throat as I instinctively took a step back, but I couldn't move fast enough. The creature stopped, turning its head towards me. For a moment, I thought it might lunge, that it might attack me, but it didn't. Instead, it raised one of its arms and pointed towards the cabin. It was a slow, deliberate motion, as if it was trying to tell me something. I couldn't understand what it wanted, what it meant, but that gesture felt like a warning. The flashlight flickered in my hand, and I cursed under my breath, trying to get it to work. I didn't want to look away from the creature, but I had no choice. The light came back on, just in time to see the figure retreat back into the woods. It didn't run. It simply backed away, its slow shuffle disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, my body trembling, unsure if I was dreaming or if what I had just seen was real. But then the reality of the situation hit me. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in this cabin, not after that. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I knew I wasn't safe here. I ran back inside, bolting the door behind me and locking every window. I could still hear the dragging sound in the distance, but I didn't dare go outside to check. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, waiting for nightfall to pass, hoping whatever it was would leave and never come back. But as the sun began to set, I heard it again. That same dragging sound, faint but persistent. I sat at the window, watching the edge of the woods, waiting for it to appear again. Hours passed, and the sound didn't stop. I was losing my mind, not knowing what to do. I had no cell service, no way of contacting anyone. It was just me, the cabin, and whatever was out there in the dark. By the time midnight came, I knew what I had to do. I had to leave. I wasn't staying in that cabin for another night. I grabbed my pack, my jacket, and made sure everything was locked up tight. I didn't care if it was dangerous or if I was making things worse by leaving. I just needed to get out. I walked through the woods, my heart racing, my eyes darting back and forth, half expecting the creature to appear at any moment. But it didn't. The woods were still unnaturally quiet. No sounds, no movement. I thought I was safe. I thought I was free. But then I saw it. In the distance, just at the edge of the woods, I saw the creature again. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, watching me. I didn't stop to look any longer. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not looking back once. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps, and my legs were burning from the effort, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and by then, the sun was starting to rise. I kept walking until I found a place with a payphone, where I finally called a ride to come pick me up. I didn't want to go back to the cabin, not ever. I didn't care if the creature was real or if it was just my imagination. I left that town behind, and I didn't look back. The last thing I remember as I drove away was the feeling of being watched, the sense that whatever it was, whatever I had seen, was still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Just me, the cabin, the woods, and a bit of peace away from the usual noise. I had rented a small, remote cabin tucked away deep in the forest, far from any town or civilization. No distractions. The perfect getaway. The kind of place you see in magazines. Wooden, rustic, with a stone fireplace and big windows that look out onto nothing but trees and sky. I thought it would be quiet. I thought I would be alone. But I wasn't. Not truly. The cabin itself looked like it had been there for decades, maybe even longer. It had an old charm to it that you couldn't fake, even if you wanted to. The wood smelled of earth and pine, and the creaky floors gave it a warmth that made it feel like it had a life of its own. A life that was settled, you could say. The moment I walked in, it felt like it had already been waiting for me. A stack of firewood by the hearth, some old books on the shelves, and the cabin was simply there, just waiting. First, it was exactly what I expected. I spent the first evening getting comfortable, unpacking, and making a fire. The sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature dropped fast, typical for a fall evening. By the time I sat down with my cup of coffee, it was pitch black outside, the kind of dark you don't often get in places where streetlights exist. Out here, the darkness was thick, like a blanket you couldn't peel away. But that was okay. I wasn't scared. I was too tired to be scared. But then something happened. A sound. It was subtle at first. The kind of sound you think you might have imagined. Maybe it was a branch cracking or the wind shifting. But it kept going. Quiet rustling. Almost like footsteps in the woods. But not quite. Too soft. Too irregular. I stood up, went to the window and looked out into the forest. It was completely still. Nothing moved. Not even the trees seemed to be swaying. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my instincts were telling me to be alert. It wasn't an animal. Not like the deer or raccoons I had seen earlier in the day. Felt different. Felt wrong. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone in the woods, and silence can make you feel like you're being watched. But then the rustling came again, louder this time, and then the unmistakable sound of something moving quickly through the underbrush. Something large. I grabbed the flashlight I had left on the counter and went to the door. The cool air hit me immediately when I stepped outside, biting at my skin. The woods were just beyond the cabin, and I scanned the tree line with the beam of the flashlight, but saw nothing. Only trees. Just the quiet, empty woods. I stepped out further, my boots crunching on the dry leaves as I made my way toward the edge of the trees. The flashlight flickered in my hand, and I shook it, frustrated with the cheap batteries I had forgotten to replace. I had no choice but to keep walking toward the sound. Maybe I was being foolish, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what was making the noise. If it was a bear or a bobcat, I could at least prepare myself. But I knew in my gut that it wasn't. Then, just as I was about to turn around, I saw something, a shape. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or a fallen log, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately, and that's when I saw it. I froze. There was something crouched between the trees, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. It wasn't quite a person, but it wasn't an animal either. It was hunched, with long limbs and a narrow body that seemed to twist and bend in unnatural ways. Its skin was pale, almost grayish, and it seemed to shimmer slightly in the weak light. The creature had no clothes, just raw skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was the worst part. The eyes were too large, round, and completely black, and its mouth was stretched into a thin, sharp line, though it didn't smile. It looked more hungry. Not hungry in the way you might expect an animal to be, but a deep, primal hunger. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away. The creature didn't move at first, just watching me with those dark, endless eyes. But then it shifted, and I heard its joints crack, like it had been holding itself in that position for too long. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by fear. I could feel the adrenaline flooding my system, the fight or flight instinct kicking in, but my body wasn't responding. I was frozen, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature disappeared into the shadows, vanishing into the trees without a sound. I didn't wait around to find out if it was coming back. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground, my breath ragged in my chest. I reached the cabin and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at the door, listening to the silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making it hard to think. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every little noise made my heart race, my mind running wild with thoughts of what that thing was. I kept hearing movement outside, the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, but every time I looked out the window, there was nothing there. It was as if the forest itself had become alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The next day, I decided I couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever that creature was to come back. I had to leave. I packed up my things quickly, throwing everything into my bag without much thought. I wanted to get out of there. The sooner, the better. But as I opened the door to leave, I stopped. Something was off. The forest outside was eerily quiet. The birds that had been chirping the day before were gone. There was no rustling in the leaves, no movement in the trees. Nothing. The world felt hollow, like the air itself had been sucked out. I walked carefully to the car, trying not to make any noise, trying not to draw attention to myself. As I started the engine and pulled out of the cabin's driveway, I glanced at the woods one last time. I swear I saw something moving in the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't look back as I drove away. Couldn't. Whatever that creature was, whatever I had seen, I knew I didn't want to find out more. As I drove down the long, winding road, I thought about the night before, about what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. I wasn't sure if it was real or if my mind had just snapped from the isolation. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that I had narrowly escaped something much worse than just an animal. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I've never gone back to that cabin, and I never will. I don't care how good the getaway looks on a brochure. Some things are better left undisturbed. I know what I saw, and I don't need to see it again. I just hope that whatever it was, it stays where it belongs, in the woods, out of sight and out of mind. I can't explain it. Maybe I never will. But I know one thing for sure. I won't be making the mistake of staying out there again. Not in those woods. Not in that cabin. Never again. The wind was picking up, whistling through the trees outside the cabin as I sat by the fire, the orange glow of the flames dancing on the rough, wooden walls around me. The smell of pine and damp earth drifted through the cracks in the windows, but it wasn't enough to mask the underlying sense of unease that had settled in my gut. It was just me out here, far from the nearest town, in a cabin I'd rented for a few days to get away from everything. Work, people, the noise of the city. I had planned for peace and quiet, but it wasn't quiet. Not really. The isolation was suffocating. The cabin was small, a one-room space with a loft, a stone fireplace, and just enough old, mismatched furniture to make it feel lived in. It was charming in a rustic way, but the uneven floorboards and creaky walls gave the whole place a kind of old, tired feeling. I had barely settled in before I noticed something was off. Maybe it was the silence. No birds, no rustling of animals in the woods, no wind in the trees, just stillness. I told myself it was the season, late fall just before the first snow, and that everything in the forest had gone quiet for the winter. But something about it still didn't sit right. I was on my second night here when it happened. The first night, I had convinced myself it was just my nerves. I'd heard something, footsteps, just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't sound like that. It was too heavy, too deliberate. I got up and looked through the cabin's small window, but saw nothing. The night was still. I tried to go back to sleep, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave me. The next evening, I was cooking dinner over the fire. A simple meal, just some canned chili and cornbread, nothing fancy. I was so focused on the pot on the stove that I almost didn't notice the sound at first. It was faint, but unmistakable. A glass bottle clinking against something hard. At first, I thought maybe it was a branch tapping against the window, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else. I stood still, listening. The sound came again. Clink, clink. This time, I was sure it was outside. My heart started beating faster. I stepped away from the stove, grabbed the flashlight that had been resting on the table, and slowly approached the door. When I opened it, there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anything unusual. The wind had picked up again, swirling the dry leaves around the cabin steps. It was empty, yet the glass shard was there, just at the edge of the porch, lying half buried in the dirt. I bent down, squinting to see what it was. It was small, jagged, and shiny. A shard of broken glass. No clue where it came from, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. Who would leave something like that out here? I stood there for a long moment, the flashlight in my hand casting odd shadows on the ground. There was a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I wasn't alone, but I shook it off. It was just my mind playing tricks, nothing more. I picked up the shard, held it in my hand for a moment, and then tossed it aside. No reason to worry, just some random piece of trash left by whoever owned the place before me. The night passed without incident, but the next day, things only got stranger. The wind picked up, blowing colder, and the forest felt unnaturally still. I went for a hike, hoping the exercise would clear my head. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt the same nagging feeling, like I was being watched. It wasn't just the wind or the trees. Something about the place felt wrong. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every shift in the brush, made my heart race a little faster. I came across an old, half-fallen tree, its branches twisted and gnarled, like something straight out of a horror story. As I walked past it, I noticed a small pile of rocks nearby, carefully stacked in a pattern. I knelt down, curious, but something about it made my skin crawl. Who would stack rocks like that out here? Felt intentional, but there was no explanation for it. Just the rocks, and that same uneasy feeling gnawing at me. I headed back to the cabin, not bothering to explore further. When I returned, I noticed something else. The glass shard was gone. I searched the porch, the ground around it, everywhere, but it wasn't there anymore. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Whoever or whatever was out there had come close enough to take it. I spent the rest of the day locked inside, the flashlight in one hand, the door bolted shut. But nothing happened. The evening came, and I ate in silence, listening to the wind howl outside. The light from the fire cast dancing shadows against the walls, and I could almost convince myself that nothing was wrong, that I was just overreacting. But I wasn't. That night I heard it again. This time it was more distinct. The sound of glass being scraped against the wood. It wasn't as faint as before. It was louder, more deliberate. I froze, staring at the door. The scraping continued, slow and steady, like someone was methodically dragging something sharp along the wood, trying to make me hear it. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The night air was cold, biting at my skin. But when I stepped outside, there was nothing. Just the forest, dark and still, the trees swaying in the wind. But then, just off to the side of the cabin, I saw something. A figure, just standing there, not moving. I froze. My stomach dropped to my feet, and my breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see a vague outline, a person or something like it. A figure standing perfectly still. Couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear. And then, in the quiet, the sound came again. The scraping of glass, this time coming from the side of the cabin where the figure stood. It was too close, too real. I stepped back, trying to keep my breathing steady, my mind racing. The figure didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge my presence. It just stood there, still as death. I knew I had to get inside. I had to lock the door, but my legs felt like stone, unable to move, like I was glued to the spot. And then, as if the figure had read my thoughts, it moved. Not toward me, but to the side. A slow, deliberate walk, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. I don't know what it was. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely. But I knew I wasn't alone. That shard of glass, the scraping sound, the figure, it wasn't random. It was intentional. Someone was out there, and they were watching me. I ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me, locking it. The fire still burned, crackling in the hearth. I grabbed the largest knife from the kitchen and sat down on the couch, staring at the door, waiting. But nothing came. No sounds, no scraping, no figure in the shadows. Just the crackle of the fire and the cold, biting air outside. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't want to stick around to find out what would happen next. There were no more glass shards, no more figures, but I didn't trust that place anymore. I drove back to town with my heart still pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. But there's one thing I've never been able to shake. The feeling that I wasn't alone that night, that someone or something was out there just watching, waiting, and I'll never know who or what it was. It was a cold evening when I arrived at the cabin. The drive had taken longer than expected. The winding road seemed to go on forever, and with each curve, the trees seemed to close in around me. There was something unnerving about the forest at night, especially when you're alone. And as I pulled up to the small cabin tucked away at the edge of the woods, I felt the weight of isolation settle in. I parked my car next to the cabin, the headlights casting long shadows over the weathered wood. The place looked like it had been sitting here for years, untouched by time, or maybe just untouched by people. It was the perfect place to get away from everything, to clear my head. I had planned to spend the weekend here, alone with my thoughts, no distractions. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the car was the silence. It was the kind of silence that felt thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. Not a single rustle from the trees, no distant calls of animals. Nothing, just quiet. I grabbed my bags from the trunk, locked the car, and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. A musty smell hit me, like old wood and damp earth. I flicked on the lights and took in the space. It was small but cozy, enough for one person, maybe two if they didn't mind being cramped. A stone fireplace sat in the center of the room, with a stack of firewood nearby. I set my bags down and started a fire, the crackling sound filling the otherwise quiet cabin. I didn't waste time unpacking. I set up a small camp in the corner with a blanket and some books. My plan was simple: relax, read, maybe go for a hike the next day. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. But as the night wore on, I started to notice things. Small things at first. The wind outside picked up, making the trees sway, their branches scratching against the cabin like they were trying to get in. I could hear the occasional creak of the wooden structure as it settled, which made sense. It was old, but there was something about the way the wind howled that night, something almost restless. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind. I focused on the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. I grabbed a book from the pile beside me and began to read, though my mind wasn't really on the words. My thoughts kept drifting back to the strange feeling that had settled over me, like I wasn't alone. The fire began to die down, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. I grabbed a couple more logs and tossed them into the hearth, watching the flames jump higher. That's when I heard it. A sound. A soft thud from somewhere outside. I froze, holding my breath, listening. There it was again. A thud. Closer this time. I set the book down, my heart beating faster. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I got up slowly and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing, just the forest stretching out as far as I could see, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The sound came again, louder this time. It was almost like someone was walking around outside, but the ground was soft, covered in leaves, so the steps didn't sound like footsteps. More like something or someone was moving through the brush, carefully but deliberately. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. It had to be an animal, maybe a deer or something. The thought of it didn't ease the tightness in my chest. I walked to the door, my hand hovering over the knob. For a moment, I considered stepping outside to see what was going on, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I knew that the last thing I wanted to do right now was wander into the woods in the middle of the night, even if it was just an animal. I turned back to the fire, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, as I had expected. It wasn't a big surprise. The cabin was miles from anything, and the signal rarely reached this far out. I tossed the phone back down on the table and tried to shake off the unease. The sound continued, coming in soft intervals, like a steady rhythm. Thud, pause, thud, pause, thud. It was coming from the back of the cabin now, just beyond the tree line. My nerves were on edge, and the warmth of the fire no longer seemed comforting. Instead, it felt like a barrier, something that kept me safely inside, away from whatever was outside. I thought about calling someone. I considered the idea of driving back into town, but the thought of getting in my car and speeding down the winding road in the dark didn't appeal to me. I decided to wait it out, hoping it was just a passing animal. But the sound kept coming closer now, as though whatever it was had circled around to the side of the cabin. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the back wall of the cabin. It was like a fist had slammed into it, hard enough to rattle the wooden planks. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the back door. Then the noise came again, this time from the side. A bang, followed by scraping, like something was dragging itself across the wall. My pulse was racing, and my mind was spinning. I didn't know what was happening, but I had the overwhelming urge to leave. But I couldn't. The forest outside felt like a prison, and the cabin, though small and isolated, was somehow a refuge. I grabbed my keys and wallet, heading for the door. But as I reached for the knob, something made me stop. It wasn't just the fear. It was the sense that I wasn't alone. The air was heavy, oppressive, like the world had gone still. I turned back toward the fire, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the room. A figure, tall and thin, with long arms that stretched out in an unnatural way. It was standing near the window just inside the cabin, watching me. My heart stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the shadow, but I couldn't move. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I ran to the window, flinging open the curtain to look outside. But there was nothing there. The wind howled again, but this time, it didn't feel like nature. It felt like something else, something watching me. I knew I needed to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. I decided to leave. Now, I grabbed my stuff and ran out the door, my feet pounding against the ground as I sprinted toward my car. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around me, but I didn't dare look back. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. As I pulled away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, no movement. Just the empty darkness of the forest stretching out behind me. The rest of the drive back to town was a blur. My mind kept racing, replaying every moment, every sound, every shadow. But in the end, there was nothing. No explanation, no answers. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't bring myself to. The memories of that night stayed with me, though. The unease, the shadows, the constant feeling that something was just out of reach. The forest felt too close, the air too thick. I've never been able to shake that feeling. I don't know what was out there, or if it was even real, but something was watching, something that didn't belong. And I'll never forget the terror of feeling like I was being hunted in the very place I thought I'd be safe. The cabin is still there, abandoned, like a forgotten memory, and I hope it stays that way. Some places are better left alone. The cabin I rented was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, just how I wanted it. A few miles up a dirt road from the nearest town, surrounded by trees and with only a thin trail cutting through the forest leading to it. I wanted peace, silence, and the kind of solitude you can't find in a city. The air was fresh, the kind that made your lungs feel full when you breathed. I had planned for a week of quiet, reading books, and just being alone with my thoughts. No distractions, no noise, no people. The first few days were peaceful, the kind of quiet that lets you hear the wind rustling the trees and the occasional squirrel darting across the forest floor. The cabin itself was small but cozy, just one room with a bed, a wood stove, and a small kitchen. There was no TV, no phone signal, and no internet. It was perfect. The weather was typical for this time of year, chilly mornings and warm afternoons. By the evening, the temperature dropped enough to warrant a fire in the stove. I would sit by the fire with a glass of wine and watch the flames flicker, thinking how lucky I was to have stumbled upon such a place. The only sounds at night were the wind, the occasional crack of a branch breaking in the distance, and the distant hoot of an owl. The 5th day in, I decided to take a walk through the woods. It was late afternoon, and the sky was already starting to turn orange with the setting sun. I grabbed my jacket, strapped on my boots, and left the cabin, closing the door behind me. The air felt crisper today, almost like a storm was coming, though the forecast didn't call for any rain. I wandered off the main trail and into a part of the woods I hadn't explored yet. The trees grew thicker here, the underbrush denser, and the ground softer underfoot, as if the area had been untouched for a long time. I noticed the silence was heavier in this part of the forest, more oppressive. It was as though something about the place made it feel different, darker, somehow. After walking for about an hour, I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. The trees around it formed a perfect circle, like a natural amphitheater. There was something strange about this place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The ground was dotted with old logs and patches of thick moss, and in the center of the clearing, there was a large stone. It looked out of place, like it had been placed there deliberately. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the odd feeling in my stomach. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was no logical reason for it. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, or maybe it was the eerie silence. Either way, I turned around to head back to the cabin. As I walked, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest felt different at night. The air was colder, and the shadows deeper. I quickened my pace, eager to get back before it was completely dark. The path seemed to twist and turn more than I remembered, and the trees seemed closer, like they were pressing in on me. It felt as though the woods were alive, watching me. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, just ahead of me, followed by a soft growl. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. I listened for a moment, but the sound had stopped. My mind raced. Could it be a bear? A wolf? I couldn't see anything through the thick trees. I stood there, still, straining my ears for any further sounds. Then I heard it again. This time, the growl was louder, more distinct. Came from just off the trail to my left. I took a slow, cautious step back, trying not to make a sound. I couldn't see anything in the growing darkness, but I knew something was out there. Something big. Something watching me. I slowly pulled out my phone, hoping to get a signal, but of course, nothing. I cursed under my breath, realizing how foolish I was for not bringing a flashlight. The rustling started again, closer this time. I backed up slowly, my eyes darting to the left, where the sound was coming from. I could make out movement in the shadows, something low to the ground, something with an odd, jerky motion. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't walking like any animal I had ever seen before. It was moving strangely, almost like it was dragging itself along the ground. My mind raced through possible explanations. Could it be a wolf with a limp? A wounded animal? But no, the movement didn't match any creature I knew. The growl came again, louder this time, but it wasn't just a growl. It was a mixture of a growl and a whine, a sound that felt wrong. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. It was low to the ground, with a hunched back and twisted legs that bent at unnatural angles. Its fur was matted, patchy, and the color was a sickly grayish-brown. Its face. There was something about its face that made my blood run cold. Its eyes were wide and reflective, glowing in the dim light. Its snout was too long, too thin, and the teeth sharp, jagged, and yellow. The thing didn't look like a dog, but it had the body of one, with a mouth that looked far too big for its face. I froze. My body screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Its eyes locked onto mine, almost as if it was studying me. The air around me felt thick, like it was hard to breathe, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then it moved. Slowly, carefully, it crept towards me, its eyes never leaving mine. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't seem to move. The creature was almost within reach now, its body sliding through the underbrush like something from a nightmare. Finally, I snapped out of my stupor and turned to run, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. The forest felt different now, as though it were working against me. The trees seemed to block my path, the underbrush grabbing at my clothes. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled, my foot catching on a root. I heard the creature behind me, its heavy breathing growing louder, and then that horrible growl again. I ran faster, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. The air burned in my lungs, my legs screamed with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. The growl was right behind me now, and I could hear its claws scraping against the ground, getting closer and closer. I dared not look back, afraid that if I did, it would be the last thing I saw. Finally, I burst into the clearing I had passed through earlier. I didn't stop. I kept running, my heart in my throat, until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I stood there for a moment, listening. I could still hear the creature outside, its growls and scratches against the cabin's wooden walls. It was pacing, circling the cabin, as if waiting for me to make a move. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just wait for it to break in. I grabbed my pack, stuffing anything I could find into it. My phone, my jacket, a flashlight I had left in the corner. I checked the window, but it was too dark to see anything outside. I couldn't hear the creature anymore, either. For a long time, I sat there in the cabin, the silence pressing in around me. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. The night passed without incident. When morning finally came, I dared peek outside. The creature was gone, but I didn't feel safe. I didn't want to stay another night in that cabin. I packed my things, left the door unlocked, and drove away without a second thought. I never went back to that cabin. Couldn't. The thing I saw out there in the woods, it wasn't a dog. It wasn't anything I could explain. But I know it was real, and I know it's still out there, somewhere in the woods. The night was colder than I'd expected when I first pulled up to the cabin. I'd rented the place for a weekend to get away from everything. Work, the noise of the city, all the constant pressure. Just me, a cabin in the woods, and the quiet. At least that's what I thought I was signing up for. The cabin was old, a little run down, but charming in a rustic way. The kind of place you see in movies, wooden walls, creaky floors, and a stone fireplace. It felt secluded, like no one could reach me for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I didn't even bother checking my phone once I got here. No service anyway, just the way I liked it. I spent the first few hours unpacking and setting up. The sun had already started to dip below the horizon by the time I got the fire going in the hearth. The wind outside howled, making the trees creak and sway in an eerie way. But that wasn't anything new. It's a cabin in the woods, after all. The evening dragged on slowly. I cooked a simple dinner, read a book by the fire, and then decided to step outside to stretch my legs. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear. Stars were scattered across the dark sky like 1,000 tiny diamonds. I wandered around the back of the cabin, taking in the stillness of the woods. The trees were thick here, and the ground was soft beneath my boots. No signs of wildlife, but the occasional rustle of leaves warned me that there were things out there, things I couldn't see. But it wasn't a comforting kind of quiet. It was the type of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. As I made my way around the cabin, something caught my eye, a shape just off in the distance moving between the trees. It was dark, and the light from the cabin's porch didn't reach far enough to make out details. I squinted, trying to figure out if it was a deer or some other animal, but it didn't move like one. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I hesitated for a moment, then shrugged it off. It was probably just some kind of large animal, bear, maybe. It didn't matter. What mattered was the fact that I was here, alone, and I wasn't going to let my mind start running wild. I went back inside, locked the door, and settled down in front of the fire again. The warmth of the flames and the crackling of the wood did little to ease the sense of unease that had started to creep up on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was an odd smell in the air, something like wet fur and earth, mixed with the scent of pine. I sniffed the air, trying to place it, but couldn't. That's when I heard the first noise. It was a low growl just on the edge of hearing, a sound that I thought was part of the wind at first. But then it came again, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and moved cautiously toward the window, peeking out through the blinds. I could see the dark shapes of the trees outside, swaying in the wind, but nothing else seemed out of place. I turned my attention back to the noise, but this time, it was clearer. A series of heavy thuds, like something large and solid was moving through the underbrush. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it moving closer to the cabin. The growls continued, Only now they were accompanied by the sound of something dragging across the ground, like claws scraping over bark or stone. My heart started to pound. I had to be imagining this. It was just an animal, probably a bear or something else roaming through the woods. But still, I didn't take any chances. I double-checked the door, making sure it was locked, then grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, just in case. I moved to the back window, positioning myself where I could see a little better. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. It was massive, too large to be any kind of normal animal. It stood on two legs, towering over the brush in front of it. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and the way it moved was unnervingly human-like. But it wasn't human. Its head was shaped like a dog's, but much larger, almost wolf-like. Its ears pricked forward, listening for something. The growls weren't from a bear, not even close. The creature sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, and I felt its gaze shift toward the cabin. For a moment, everything went still. I don't know why, but I froze, holding my breath. My mind raced. What the hell was that thing? It wasn't something I could recognize. No animal I'd ever seen or heard of. It was as if it didn't belong. Then, the creature turned and moved away, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. My legs nearly gave out, but I managed to stay standing, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. It wasn't a bear or even a large wolf. This thing was something else, something I couldn't explain. I sat back down by the fire, trying to collect myself. My head was spinning, but I knew I couldn't leave. I was miles from the nearest town, and whatever that thing was, it wasn't likely to show itself again. Or so I told myself. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Every now and then, I'd hear the occasional rustle of branches, but nothing else. I stayed awake by the fire, keeping the poker close. At some point, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I dozed off, curled up in the chair near the hearth. The flames had died down to embers when I was woken by a noise outside. A soft thudding, followed by the same low growl from before. My heart leaped into my throat as I shot to my feet. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I crept over to the window again, but this time, I didn't dare peek outside. Instead, I stayed low, watching the shadows move outside from between the slats of the blinds. I heard the growling get louder, closer. The thing was circling the cabin. It had come back. I felt a wave of panic, realizing how exposed I was. The cabin, despite being sturdy, felt too fragile in that moment. The wind outside seemed to pick up, and I could hear the thing moving around, its claws scraping against the stone foundation of the cabin. My mind raced with thoughts of how to get out, but I knew it would be useless. I was trapped. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. I didn't know if the thing had left, or if it was waiting for me to make a move. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, holding my breath, for what felt like hours. But then, just as I thought I might have a chance to escape, the growl returned, louder, more aggressive. It was coming from right outside the front door. It was close enough that I could hear the steady breathing, the rasp of air being sucked in and out. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I grabbed the fire poker and held it in front of me, moving slowly toward the door. I had no plan, no strategy, just the raw instinct to survive. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle. I never got the chance to open it. The door slammed against the wall with a force that shook the whole cabin. The creature, whatever it was there. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was in the doorway, blocking any way out. The thing let out a deep, rumbling growl, and I was sure I saw its glowing eyes pierce through the darkness. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it backed away. It turned, its massive body disappearing into the night with another sigh that sounded almost human. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran to the back door, fumbled with the lock, and bolted outside, not looking back until I was safely in my car. I didn't return to the cabin after that. I drove straight back into town, terrified to even think about what I had seen. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not at first. Who would believe me? The creature in the woods, the growls, the human-like eyes. It didn't make sense. But I knew what I saw, and I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back there again. It was one of those weekends when you're just looking to escape the city and get some peace and quiet. The kind of weekend where you want nothing more than to sit in a small cabin, read a book, and listen to nothing but the rustle of trees and the occasional bird calling out. So when my friends invited me to join them at a cabin in the middle of nowhere, I was quick to say yes. The place they'd rented was deep in the woods, nestled between thick trees and a small creek. The closest town was over an hour away, and the idea of being so far removed from anything familiar felt like the perfect antidote to the noise and stress of everyday life. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking low behind the trees. The cabin was small, built from dark wood, and had a sort of rustic charm to it. The porch had a couple of old rocking chairs, and there was a small woodpile stacked neatly beside the door. The air was crisp, a little chillier than I expected for the season. Still, it was one of those evenings that felt good to be outside, even if just for a little while. Inside the cabin, it was cozy, the kind of warmth that settles into your bones after a long day. There was a fireplace in the living room, a long wooden table, and a couple of worn-out couches. A large window framed a view of the woods, and the only thing I could hear was the occasional creak of the house settling. Perfect. We unpacked our things and everyone started to unwind. Some of us began preparing dinner while others set up for a game of cards. It felt good to be away from everything, and for a while, the idea of spending a couple of days like this seemed like nothing could go wrong. As night fell, we settled around the fire in the living room. The cabin had no electricity, so we used candles for light, their flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. The air grew colder, but the fire kept us warm. The conversation flowed easily at first, laughing, joking, and just enjoying the rare silence of the night. But then, after a while, things started to feel off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about the night felt different. It wasn't anything tangible, just a sensation, a prickling on the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see something moving just outside, but the darkness beyond was still. Nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. At some point, I decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, inhaling deeply as I looked up at the clear sky. The moon was almost full, casting a pale light over the surrounding trees. The night was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I stood there for a few minutes trying to push the unease from my mind, but then I heard it, a faint sound from deep in the woods, just beyond the clearing. It was hard to describe at first, like a faint, muffled rustling, the kind you might hear when a large animal is moving through the underbrush. But it wasn't just one rustle, it was consistent, as if something was moving toward the cabin, carefully, deliberately. My heart rate sped up. I listened harder, trying to figure out what it was. There were no animals I knew of that would be out this close to the cabin, at least not at this hour. I didn't know much about the area, but I had a gut feeling that whatever it wasn't something I wanted to mess with. I took a deep breath and turned back to the door, about to head inside, when I heard something else. This time it was louder, a soft thud, followed by another. I froze. Something was out there. My eyes scanned the darkness, my mind racing as I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or a bear, something harmless. But the thuds were getting closer, deliberate, too close. I hurried back inside, closing the door behind me, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. The others were still sitting around the fire, talking quietly. I didn't say anything at first, just sat down and tried to act normal. But the unease in the air was thick now. It felt like the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The next couple of hours passed slowly. We ate dinner and played a few rounds of cards, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard outside. I was on edge, glancing toward the window every few seconds, half expecting to see something, or someone, moving through the trees. The night felt heavy, as if it was pressing in on us from all sides. Around midnight, we all started heading to bed. The others seemed content to call it a night, but I wasn't sure I could sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sounds I'd heard, the thuds in the dark, growing louder. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help it. I lay in bed, the sound of the wind outside the only thing I could hear now. It was the kind of wind that makes the trees creak and groan, a constant, low sound that filled the silence. It wasn't long before I drifted off, but my sleep wasn't peaceful. I kept waking up, half sure I could hear something moving just outside my window. At one point, I even thought I saw a shadow flicker past the window, but when I looked again, nothing was there. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. The sun had barely risen, and the cabin was still dark. The others were already up, making breakfast. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened the night before. They'd probably just laugh it off as nerves or my imagination running wild. Still, I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see something standing just beyond the trees, watching. It wasn't until later in the day that we noticed something odd. The front door of the cabin had been left slightly ajar. None of us had opened it after we went to bed the night before, and I was certain that I had locked it before going to bed. But there it was, hanging open, just wide enough for someone, or something, to slip inside unnoticed. I didn't say anything at first, but the others started noticing too. It was strange, unsettling. I walked around the cabin, checking the windows and doors, but everything else seemed fine. Nothing appeared out of place, yet the door was open, as if someone had been there during the night. We spent the rest of the day keeping a close watch, but whatever had been out there the night before never revealed itself again. The unease remained, though. I couldn't stop feeling like we were being watched. The woods seemed too still, too quiet. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled. Felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. By the time night came again, I was too anxious to go to bed. I sat up in the living room with one of my friends, watching the fire flicker and crackle. The wind outside had picked up again, and the trees were swaying in the breeze. It was almost peaceful, except for that lingering feeling that something was wrong. We took turns standing guard at the window, peering into the darkness. Every now and then, I thought I saw something, just a glimpse of movement, a flash of something out of the corner of my eye. But each time I looked again, there was nothing. The hours passed, but nothing happened. No more thuds, no more shadows. By the time I finally crawled into bed, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. The sense of being watched didn't go away, but I was too tired to keep worrying about it. The next morning, we packed up and left. As we drove away from the cabin, I looked back at the trees one last time. For the first time since we arrived, I felt like I could breathe again, the weight lifting off my chest as we made our way down the road, leaving the woods behind. We never did figure out who or what was outside the cabin that night, but it didn't matter. I was just glad to be far away from there. And as we drove further from the cabin, I realized that sometimes the woods don't just give you peace and quiet. Sometimes they give you something far more unsettling. Something you don't fully understand but feel deep in your gut. Something you don't ever want to encounter again. I was never one to shy away from nature. Growing up, I spent plenty of time camping with my family, hiking, and exploring remote areas. But the cabin we rented that weekend was different from any place I'd ever been to. Nestled deep in the woods, far from any town, the small log cabin looked peaceful at first glance. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth, a mixture that immediately made me feel at ease. It was the perfect getaway, quiet, isolated, and untouched. At least that's what I thought when I first arrived. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was setting behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the landscape. The cabin, a rustic structure with a sloped roof and a small porch, stood alone against the backdrop of towering trees. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the leaves in the wind and the distant calls of birds. Inside, the cabin was cozy. A stone fireplace dominated the living room, with mismatched furniture scattered around. It was like stepping into a place that had been left alone for years, yet still cared for. The kitchen had a stove and an old refrigerator, the kind you only find in cabins that haven't been renovated in decades. A wooden table stood in the corner, with mismatched chairs around it. The floors creaked underfoot, and the air had a certain mustiness to it, as if it hadn't been aired out properly in months. I wasn't bothered by it, though. It was all part of the charm. We unloaded our bags and got comfortable, setting up for the weekend. The plan was simple: relax, cook meals together, and enjoy the quiet. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only traffic was the occasional deer or the odd bird flitting through the trees. There was a sense of freedom that came with being so far removed from civilization. That evening, we sat around the fireplace, sipping coffee and telling stories. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending occasional sparks up the chimney. Outside, the darkness was absolute, with no lights visible for miles. It was the kind of night where everything felt distant, like the world was far away, and the cabin was its own little universe. We went to bed early, settling into the small, creaky rooms. But something felt off the moment the lights went out. I don't know if it was the silence, or maybe the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The cabin, despite its warmth and comfort, felt too still, the kind of stillness that presses against you. I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place, the kind of nervous energy that comes from sleeping in a new spot. It was probably nothing. I woke up in the middle of the night, the usual quietness of the forest pressing against the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the trees, but then I heard it, the faintest sound of something shifting in the woods outside. It was almost imperceptible, like the soft rustling of leaves, but there was a weight to it, a deliberate movement like something large was pushing through the underbrush. I lay still, straining my ears in the dark. The sound didn't stop. It came in slow, calculated steps, crunching leaves underfoot, pausing occasionally as if whatever it was trying to make itself unseen. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else entirely, but I knew one thing for sure. It was too close. The cabin was old, and the walls weren't exactly soundproof. I could hear every creak and groan of the timber. The sound outside came closer. The footsteps, now unmistakable, were right at the edge of the porch. I could hear something heavy brushing against the wooden planks. Whatever it was, it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. It moved like it belonged there, like it knew no one would stop it. I wanted to get up, to do something, but I was frozen. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A large animal? But then I realized the sound wasn't right for that. A bear doesn't creep up to a house like that. This was something deliberate. I waited. The sound stopped, and the night fell into a tense, suffocating silence. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was overreacting. Maybe a raccoon or something small had brushed against the porch. I had to calm down. But the silence was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Eventually, the sounds faded, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there for hours, staring into the dark, straining to hear anything that would make sense of what had happened. I finally managed to drift off, but it wasn't restful sleep. Morning came too soon. The sunlight streamed through the small windows, and I could hear birds chirping outside. But the peace didn't settle in my chest as it should have. I felt unsettled, like something was out of place. I couldn't explain it, but it was there. We spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the odd feeling that had settled over me. The woods were beautiful, expansive, and quiet. The trail wound through tall trees and across small streams. But even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching from the shadows. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon again. As we approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The front door, which had been closed tightly the night before, was now slightly ajar, just enough for someone to have slipped inside. My heart started racing. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe the wind had blown it open, but I knew it wasn't true. I had checked that door before we went out, and it had been locked. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to check the cabin, but I had no choice. Slowly, I stepped forward and pushed the door open. The interior looked unchanged, but there was an odd scent in the air now, musty, like something had been moved around. I checked every room. Everything was in place. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for that lingering feeling that something wasn't right. I locked the door and bolted it shut, then pulled the blinds down over the windows. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I locked every door and window. I didn't care how paranoid I seemed. I wasn't going to take any chances. I stayed awake, lying in bed, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and branches, but every so often, I could hear something else. The softest sound of movement just beyond the cabin. A scraping noise, like something or someone was dragging something along the ground. My heart raced again. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things, but every part of me knew it wasn't just the wind. I waited. Every minute felt like an hour. Then, it came again. A slow, steady movement around the side of the cabin. I didn't move, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I just listened, my heart thumping so loudly I was sure it could be heard outside. The sound moved past the window closer to the door. Then it stopped. For what felt like an eternity, everything was still. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could be a person, could be an animal. But why would it be so deliberate? Why was it so careful? I couldn't stay there any longer. I needed to do something. I slowly got out of bed, making as little noise as possible. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the door. My breath was shallow, and my hands shook as I reached for the door handle. I paused. The sound was still there, just outside the door. It was the same scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. My mind raced, my body on edge, but I had to know. I had to see. I took a deep breath, then swung the door open with as much force as I could muster. The porch was empty. For a split second, I thought I was imagining everything. But then I noticed something. A large, deep indent in the dirt right by the door. It wasn't just a mark from the ground. It was like something had been dragged across the earth. The indent was fresh, and it led into the woods. I didn't wait. I didn't care if I was being foolish. I grabbed my bag, threw on my shoes, and ran out into the night, my heart racing as I sprinted into the woods, away from the cabin, away from whatever had been lurking just outside. I ran for what felt like forever, not looking back, not stopping until I reached a nearby road where I finally stopped, gasping for air. My legs were burning, but I didn't care. I couldn't go back to that cabin. I couldn't be near it anymore. The next morning, I called the rental company, told them I had to leave, and explained the strange things that had happened. They didn't seem surprised. In fact, they mentioned that others had reported similar incidents in the area, but they always shrugged it off as wild animals. I didn't care about their explanation. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Whatever it was that stalked the porch, whatever it was that followed me through the woods, I'll never know. But I'll never forget that feeling. The feeling that something was out there, waiting. It was the kind of quiet night you get when you're deep in the woods, far from any road or town. I'd been planning this weekend trip to the cabin for months, looking for some peace and a break from everything that had been building up in my life. My plan was simple: get away, clear my head, and just enjoy the solitude. The cabin was small, wooden, nestled on the edge of a dense forest, with a lake nearby. Perfect place to just be alone. The drive out there had been longer than I remembered, and as I turned off the main road, I was already starting to feel the isolation. The trees were thick, and the sun had started to dip behind the hills, leaving a golden haze in the sky that soon turned to twilight. I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, crunched under my tires, and parked right in front of the cabin. It was a little rundown, but that's what I liked about it. No one would bother me. No neighbors, no interruptions. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and walked up to the door. It creaked a little as I opened it, and the smell of pine and old wood greeted me. Inside, it was simple. A small living room with a fireplace, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been touched in a while, and a staircase leading up to a loft where I'd be sleeping. The place felt off, but not in a scary way, just in a way that reminded me how disconnected it was from the rest of the world. I started a fire in the living room, more for the atmosphere than any real need for warmth, and set up my things. The cabin wasn't big, so it didn't take long. I had brought a couple of books, my journal, and a stack of snacks for the weekend. As I settled in, the quiet of the place enveloped me. No cars, no people, just the wind rustling the trees outside and the occasional crackle of the fire. After a while, the darkness outside seemed to creep in, and the shadows inside the cabin stretched longer, making everything feel a little heavier. I'd brought a small lantern with me for the night, and I lit it, setting it on the table next to me. The flickering light helped, but there was something about the darkness beyond the cabin that started to feel oppressive, like it was closing in. I hadn't really expected to hear anything. This place was remote after all, but when I heard the first noise, I wasn't sure what to think. It came from outside, distant at first. A soft thump, like something heavy dropping onto the ground. Maybe an animal. I didn't think much of it. The forest was full of wildlife, and I wasn't exactly on edge. But then there was another sound, closer this time. A scrape like a branch being dragged across the ground. I stood up, listening. My heartbeat quickened a bit, but I chalked it up to my nerves. It was just a bear or something, probably rummaging through the area for food. There were no other houses for miles, but animals had no need to respect boundaries. I took a few steps toward the window, peering out through the curtains. Nothing. The moonlight made the trees look like jagged silhouettes against the sky, but there was no sign of movement. I shook my head, feeling a little silly. Whatever it was gone now. I sat back down, but the unease didn't go away. I pulled my feet up onto the couch and wrapped myself in a blanket. The fire crackled, and I opened one of my books, trying to distract myself. But the noise from outside kept gnawing at me, like a nagging itch I couldn't reach. An hour passed. Another noise, this time closer. I stopped reading and listened hard, straining my ears to catch the sound. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something scraping across dirt, but not in a rhythm. It was deliberate. I set the book down slowly, my eyes flicking to the window again. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but my gut told me something was out there. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a large animal, maybe even a branch caught in the wind, moving and dragging along the ground. But I had that feeling in the pit of my stomach, the kind that tells you that you're not alone, that something isn't quite right. I grabbed a flashlight and walked over to the door, hesitating. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I felt this odd pressure to check. I opened the door just a crack, enough to peek outside, but the beam of the flashlight didn't reveal much, just the darkness. I stepped out onto the porch, my boots crunching against the gravel. I scanned the woods, but nothing. It was dead quiet. Even the wind had stopped. There was no sign of whatever had made the noise. My breath caught in my chest as I stepped further into the yard, my flashlight sweeping the ground. A couple of deer tracks in the mud, a few disturbed leaves, but nothing else. No signs of life. I was starting to feel ridiculous. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd been too used to the noise of the city, and now, in this strange quiet, even the smallest sound felt amplified. I turned back to the cabin, telling myself that everything was fine. But then there was a noise again, a loud snap like a twig breaking underfoot. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This time, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. It was close. I turned quickly, sweeping the flashlight over the trees. There, in the distance, just at the edge of the light's reach, I saw something. A shadow, moving. My heart skipped a beat. It was too far away to make out any detail, but it was there. I could feel it. I stood frozen, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure was tall, too tall to be an animal, and it was moving slowly, deliberately. I swallowed hard. I wasn't going to stay out here alone. The shadows in the trees felt like they were closing in. I backed up slowly toward the cabin, keeping the light on the shape. It didn't move closer, but it didn't retreat either. It just stood there, watching me. When I reached the door, I slammed it shut and locked it, breathing hard. My eyes darted around the cabin, looking for something, anything, that could explain what I'd just seen. The fire was still going, but its warmth felt distant now. The room felt colder. I went to the window and pulled the curtains aside just enough to look out again. The figure was gone. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind. But my heart wasn't convinced. The woods felt wrong now, like they were hiding something. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every little sound. The creaks of the cabin settling, the rustling of branches against the roof, the snap of twigs breaking outside. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. I was exhausted, but I didn't dare sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow moving in the trees. I knew something was out there, but what? Eventually, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a branch breaking. It was footsteps, slow, methodical, the crunch of leaves underfoot, just beyond the cabin. I stood, holding my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps moved around the cabin, not hurried, but deliberate. It was circling me. My mind raced. Was someone playing a prank? Was I just imagining things? But no, I knew what I was hearing. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just the woods. Something was out there, something big enough to be making that sound. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. I was alone. The realization hit me hard, like a cold wave washing over me. I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't prepared for the isolation, for the silence that pressed in around me. The footsteps stopped. I waited, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. The air in the cabin felt thick with tension. And then nothing, just complete silence. Minutes passed. I don't know how many, but eventually, I got up, slowly, carefully, and went to the door. I cracked it open just enough to peer out into the darkness. The flashlight was still on the porch, discarded when I'd rushed inside earlier. I stepped outside again, the cold night air biting at my skin. The forest was still. No movement, no sounds, just the rustling of leaves. I scanned the area with the flashlight, the beams sweeping across the trees, the grass, the edge of the lake. But there was nothing, no shadow, no movement. I didn't know what it was or who it was, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying there another night. I packed my things in a frenzy, my hands shaking, and drove away from that cabin before the sun came up. I didn't care what time it was. I just wanted to be as far from that place as possible. As I drove back down the winding road, the woods receding in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that had been watching me. I don't know what it was, but I never went back to that cabin again. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the isolation, the quiet, the eerie stillness of the place. But whatever it was, I knew I wasn't meant to be there alone. And I wasn't going to risk finding out what else might be lurking in those woods. I was alone at the cabin for the weekend, something I decided to do for peace and quiet. It was the kind of place that felt isolated from the world, tucked away deep in the woods, far from civilization. The nearest neighbor was miles away. No cars, no bustling crowds, just the wind, trees, and silence. I had been here before with friends, but this time I was alone. It was the perfect place to clear my head. I arrived late in the afternoon, just before the sun dipped below the treetops. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and built out of old timber, with a stone chimney sticking out of the roof. Inside, there was a single room with a small kitchen and a wood stove in the corner. The walls were lined with old wooden beams, giving it a cozy, almost comforting feel. A couple of large windows let in the light, though they were mostly covered in thick vines that had grown unchecked over the years. The porch was wrapped around the front, and I could just imagine sitting out there in the evenings, watching the sun go down. I set my things down and went about getting a fire going in the stove. The chill of the evening air started creeping in, and the warmth from the crackling fire was a relief. The whole place smelled of wood and earth, with a faint musty scent of old paper and dust. The quiet was something I hadn't realized I'd missed. All I could hear was the wind in the trees, the occasional crackle from the fire, and the distant calls of birds. As night fell, I took a seat on the couch by the fire, enjoying the calm. There was no TV, no internet, no distractions, just the flickering light and the peaceful solitude. I was starting to feel like I could truly unwind when something caught my attention. It was a sound from outside, soft, but distinct. A rustling, like something moving in the brush just beyond the tree line. First, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a deer or some other animal. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The sound was strange. It wasn't the normal rustling of leaves or the scurrying of small animals. This was deliberate, almost like something was walking around the cabin. Not just a random animal, but something pacing, circling. I stood up, walked to the window, and peered out into the darkness. The porch light illuminated a small area in front of the cabin, but beyond that, it was just black. I couldn't see anything. No movement, no shapes, just the thick trees standing still in the night. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably an animal that had gotten too curious about the cabin. I turned away from the window and walked back to the stove, poking the fire. I tried to relax again, but the unease lingered. A few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time, a distinct scraping sound. Something was dragging along the ground. My heart skipped a beat. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and stepped outside onto the porch. The cold air hit me immediately, but I didn't care. My eyes scanned the area in front of me, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The beam shook slightly as I moved it, but I saw nothing. Just the empty night, the trees, the dark ground. But then I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the beam. Something large, low to the ground, moving slowly. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The thing was crouching, barely visible, its body blending with the shadows. At first, I thought it was some large animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar. But there was something wrong with it. Its shape was off, unnatural. I took a step back, the light flickering slightly in my hand as I adjusted the beam. The creature stopped moving for a moment, as if it had noticed me. I couldn't see its face, but its body was unnervingly distorted. It was long and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was an odd pale gray, almost sickly, and it appeared to shimmer slightly, like it was wet. It was crouched low, its arms hanging almost to the ground, with claws that dug into the earth. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound, but I had to know what this thing was. The creature's head turned slowly, and that's when I saw its face, or at least what I thought was its face. It had no clear eyes, no nose, just two hollow sockets. It looked like something you might see in a nightmare, a twisted version of something that should have been alive. It seemed to be staring at me, but there was no expression, no indication of what it was thinking. It just watched. A chill ran through me, and I backed up a few more steps, the light shaking in my hand now. The creature's head tilted, and for a moment, I thought it might approach me. But then, it just slowly turned and began to move away, blending back into the darkness of the trees. I didn't know what to think. Was I just seeing things? Was I hallucinating? I couldn't be sure, but everything in me screamed to get inside, lock the door, and stay away from the windows. I rushed back into the cabin, closing the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breath. For the next few hours, I didn't move from my seat by the fire. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made me jump, but nothing happened. The night stretched on, and eventually, I fell asleep in my chair, the fire burning low. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was already up, and the cabin was silent again. The strange feeling from the night before hadn't entirely left, but I tried to push it aside. I had to get moving, get out of the cabin, and focus on something else. I wasn't going to let one odd experience ruin my weekend. I decided to take a walk through the woods, just to clear my head. The air was fresh and crisp, and the trees were still covered in morning dew. The birds were chirping, and everything seemed normal. But the further I walked, the more I started to notice something strange. There were odd marks on the trees, deep scratches, almost like something had tried to climb them. The bark was shredded in places, and the ground beneath was torn up, as though something had been dragging itself along. The trail led me deeper into the woods, but something about it didn't feel right. It was like I was being led somewhere, like I was being watched. I followed the marks until I reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing, there was something that made my stomach drop. It was a pile of animal bones, all scattered in a circle. But what was worse was the way they were arranged. It wasn't just a random pile. The bones were carefully placed, almost like some kind of ritualistic arrangement. I couldn't make sense of it. I quickly turned and started walking back to the cabin, my mind racing. Had that creature been responsible for this? What was it? What did it want? When I returned to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat by the fire again, staring into the flames. I tried to make sense of everything, but the more I thought about it, the more confused and terrified I became. I kept asking myself if I had imagined it, if I had been too caught up in the isolation and the silence. But deep down, I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. I stayed inside, occasionally glancing out the windows, but I never saw anything again. The sun set, and the quiet of the night returned. But this time, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that had watched me, something that still knew I was here. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed by the fire, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. I didn't go outside. I didn't dare. And the next morning, I packed up and left, not even bothering to clean up. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I still don't know what I saw that night, and I'm not sure I want to know. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. I arrived at the cabin around dusk, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange, but the woods surrounding it already began to sink into darkness. The air had that crisp bite to it, a familiar cold that clung to the back of your neck. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was narrow, almost too tight for my car to pass through, with trees leaning in from both sides like sentinels. I could feel my tires crunching against the stones, each turn feeling more isolated from the rest of the world. I wasn't exactly excited about being out here alone, but the silence of the woods, the stillness, had a way of drawing me in. The cabin was one of those old, rustic places, the kind you find in stories. Weathered wood, a chimney that barely puffed out any smoke, and a small porch that creaked under your weight. It had been passed down through my family for generations. A weekend getaway that had always been more of a chore than a retreat. Still, something about it had always made me feel connected to my past, to people I never really knew. I grabbed my duffel bag and the cooler from the trunk of my car, pulling the heavy door closed behind me. The sun had almost disappeared, leaving the cabin in a dim, fading light. The front porch light was on, which was a relief. Even the smallest bit of light helped. As I stepped onto the porch, the old wooden boards groaned beneath my feet, and the door, hanging on one last hinge, swung open with a familiar, sluggish creak. I stepped inside. The smell of stale wood and dust filled my nose immediately. The cabin had been empty for months, and no one had bothered to clean it. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the wooden floors were warped from years of exposure to the elements. I walked over to the fireplace, pulling some logs from the pile stacked by the wall. The matches struck with a scratch, and soon enough the fire began to crackle. The warmth was comforting as the light flickered across the room, illuminating the worn furniture and the old framed pictures on the walls. They looked like family portraits from another time. Faded, blurry figures that I couldn't quite place. I unpacked my things, setting up my little corner of the cabin. I wasn't planning to stay long, just a night, maybe two, to unwind. The quiet had a way of making everything feel clearer, even the thoughts I usually pushed away. The fire crackled louder, and I pulled a blanket from the back of the couch. Curling up with a book, trying to ignore the deep feeling that something wasn't quite right. The evening passed quietly, the sound of the wind howling softly outside and the occasional rustle of a branch brushing against the cabin. The fire began to die down, leaving only a faint glow in the hearth. I could hear the sounds of the woods outside, but they seemed distant, muffled by the thickness of the walls. It was peaceful, but that quiet was almost too quiet. I decided to call it a night, grabbing a flashlight and heading upstairs to the bedroom. The stairs creaked with every step, echoing in the otherwise silent cabin. The bed was old, the mattress sagging in the middle, but it was comfortable enough. I pulled the thick quilt up over me and shut off the light, letting my eyes adjust to the faint glow coming from the fire below. For a while, everything felt okay. But then I heard it, a soft thump, then another. I froze, listening. It wasn't the usual creaks of an old house, but something deliberate, something that felt too purposeful. My heart rate picked up, and I pushed the covers off, slipping out of bed as quietly as I could. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the stairs. The thumping continued, each one a little louder, and I felt my pulse in my throat. I turned off the flashlight as I reached the stairs, trying to make myself as quiet as possible. The thumping had stopped for a moment, and I strained my ears, trying to hear anything more. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I moved down the stairs, the wood beneath my feet seeming to scream with every step. The thumping resumed, now louder, closer. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was coming from outside, just beyond the door. My mind raced through possible explanations. A raccoon? A deer? Something mundane. But there was no mistaking the rhythm of it. It wasn't an animal. It was too human. I grabbed the handle of the door, my breath shallow as I opened it slightly, just enough to peek out. The cold air hit me, biting at my face. I scanned the yard, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the trees, the shadows, but there was nothing. The yard stretched out in front of me, dark and quiet, the trees standing like sentries against the night. I waited, heart pounding in my chest, but the thumping had stopped. I stepped out onto the porch, every instinct telling me to turn back inside, but curiosity had me rooted to the spot. I swept the light over the ground, expecting to see an animal or some other explanation, but then my flashlight caught something strange. A shape, a figure, barely visible at the edge of the yard near the tree line. It was a person. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind me. My breath was coming fast now, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Maybe I was just overreacting. It had to be an animal, something shadowy that looked like a person from a distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that someone was out there watching. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, my eyes darting to the windows every few seconds, the flashlight in my hand trembling slightly. The wind outside began to pick up, howling through the trees like it was alive. Every gust seemed to carry a new sound. A scratch against the windows, a knock at the door, something that couldn't be explained. By the time morning came, I had barely slept. I was exhausted, but my nerves were on edge. I forced myself to get up, to do something normal. I grabbed a cup of coffee and went out to the porch to check the yard. But there was nothing there. No sign of anyone. Nothing that could explain the figure I'd seen. I didn't want to stay, but I knew I had to. It felt like something had shifted in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I spent the day wandering around the property, checking the locks on all the doors and windows, ensuring nothing had been tampered with. The woods seemed quieter now, as if holding their breath. As night fell again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I locked every door and window and spent the evening sitting by the fire, trying to ignore the sounds of the wind outside and the occasional creaks from the old cabin. The thumping had stopped, but I kept hearing something else. A rustling, like someone moving around just beyond the trees. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things, grabbed my keys, and drove out of there before the sun set. Looking back at the cabin in the rearview mirror, I could see it standing there, silent and unmoving, just as it always had. But something inside me told me I would never come back. Some things I realized were better left alone in the woods. The night was settling in faster than I had anticipated. I had arrived at the cabin earlier that day, thinking I would have the whole evening to get acquainted with the place, settle in, and enjoy a bit of solitude before the rush of people came the next morning. I had chosen this cabin for its location, remote, quiet, nestled in the woods at the edge of a small, almost forgotten lake. It was the kind of place that promised peace, a break from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. As the sun sank behind the trees, the cabin, built of aged wood with its heavy stone chimney, looked more and more like the kind of place I could spend the night in without feeling the need to rush back to civilization. I could hear the sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional rustling of leaves, the far-off call of an owl. The only light now came from the small lamps inside the cabin, casting long, soft shadows along the wooden walls. I had spent some time earlier walking along the lake, dipping my hands in the cold water, watching the faint ripples disappear into the darkness. There was a peacefulness to it, but also something about the lake that made it feel like it was hiding something. The stillness of the water reflected the trees on the opposite shore perfectly, but it felt off, like something was waiting beneath the surface. After the walk, I had returned to the cabin, thrown a couple of logs in the fireplace, and started heating up some canned soup. The little kitchenette was small but cozy, and the crackle of the fire was reassuring. I ate quietly, listening to the creaking of the cabin settling, the occasional pop from the logs burning. As the fire burned low, I started feeling a growing sense of unease, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The cabin was warm and safe, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. The problem was that every time I looked out of the window, the world outside seemed darker, as though the trees and the lake were closing in around me. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it felt thick. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, the quiet too loud after a few days of constant noise. I stood up to stoke the fire and made sure the doors were locked, then grabbed my flashlight and went out to check on the small shed near the cabin where I had left my gear. The flashlight beam cut through the blackness like a blade, slicing into the deep shadows of the forest. I stepped outside, feeling the coolness of the air against my face, the weight of the night pressing in on me. The shed was only a few yards away, but I still felt a strange hesitation in my steps, as if something out there in the trees didn't want me to go. I shook it off again. There was no reason for me to feel this way, just the woods. The sounds of the forest were calming, I thought. I reached the shed, opened the door, and grabbed a few extra supplies, none of them anything that should have made me feel uncomfortable. On my way back to the cabin, I thought I saw movement in the trees. A shadow that was just a little too large, a shape that didn't quite match the way the shadows should fall. I stopped. The beam of my flashlight swept across the trees, but there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, waiting for something to give. The silence was overwhelming, almost suffocating. Then I heard it, just a soft rustle, almost like something large moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. I was definitely alone. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. I turned quickly, rushing back toward the cabin, more out of instinct than rational thought. The flashlight shook in my hand, its light cutting through the dark like a thread. My feet slapped against the wooden porch of the cabin as I pushed open the door, shutting it behind me with a hard thud. I was breathing too fast. My hands were shaking. I locked the door and tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Probably an animal. There were plenty of animals around here, deer, maybe even a bear or a wild boar. But something about the movement I saw didn't feel like an animal. It felt deliberate, too calculated. Like someone was watching. The fire was almost out now, just embers. I didn't bother adding more logs. The thought of walking back out to the shed for more would make my skin crawl. So I sat, pulling a blanket around my shoulders, trying to calm myself. The wind outside picked up, making the trees creak and sway. I looked out the window, straining my eyes to see past the dark outline of the forest. The darkness seemed deeper now, as if the trees had moved closer to the cabin in the time it took for me to gather my thoughts. Then I heard it again, the rustling, this time much closer. I stood up quickly, heart racing, mind spinning. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed to the door, opening it just enough to peer out. Nothing. The beam of light flickered over the porch, the dark trees, but there was no movement. Then I saw something, a dark shape, someone standing at the edge of the trees, just outside the range of my light. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. There was a figure. It didn't move, just stood there, as still as the trees themselves. My mind raced. Was it an animal? No, this was something human, or at least shaped like one. My first thought was to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. If it was a person, I didn't want to risk making a sound. I backed away from the door, eyes still fixed on the figure in the dark. It didn't move, not even a twitch. It was almost as though it was waiting for me to make the next move. The longer I stared, the more the figure seemed to melt into the night, becoming indistinguishable from the trees around it. I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. This place was so isolated, the signal was spotty at best. I was completely alone. I considered locking myself in the bathroom, but that seemed pointless. I had no idea what this person wanted, but the cabin wasn't exactly a fortress. I needed a plan, fast. I decided to leave the cabin. As terrifying as that was, I had to know what was going on. I grabbed the keys to the truck, my flashlight, and moved toward the door slowly. I had to get out of here. Whatever was out there wasn't going away. I crept outside, the flashlight beam trembling in my hands. The air was cold now, biting. The wind picked up again, making the trees sway and groan. My truck was parked just a little ways off behind the cabin. I aimed the light in that direction, but the beam barely made a dent in the dark. It felt as though the night itself was swallowing the light. Then I heard something, a footstep, crunching on the gravel, not far behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight into the dark. There was no one there. My heart hammered in my chest. I was done. I couldn't stay out here anymore. I was ready to sprint to the truck, but something in my gut told me to wait, just for a moment longer. The silence felt too thick, too oppressive. I took one more look toward the trees, and that's when I saw it. The figure, the same one from before, had moved closer. Just a shadow, but now it was standing not 20 feet away, staring directly at me. It was tall, too tall to be a regular person, its outline fuzzy and distorted in the dim light. My legs froze. I could feel the panic setting in. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and melted back into the forest, moving like smoke among the trees. I couldn't move for a long moment, my mind too jumbled to process what had just happened. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I had to get out. I ran. I ran to the truck, jumped in, and started the engine. The headlights flicked on, cutting through the dark. I didn't even check behind me. I just put the pedal to the metal and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, miles away from that cabin. I finally pulled over and called for help. The dispatcher wasn't surprised by my story, but I could tell from the tone of her voice she had heard it before. There were reports of people disappearing in the area, hikers going missing, strange sightings near the lake. They never found anyone out there. No one knew what happened that night. All I knew was that I wasn't going back. Not ever. And I would never look at the trees or the dark the same way again. It was late October, and I was out in the woods, staying at an old cabin in the middle of nowhere. I had decided to take a break from everything, a chance to get away and clear my head. I'd been through a lot recently, and a few days in the mountains sounded like just what I needed. The cabin was rustic but comfortable enough, nestled deep in the forest where no one could bother me. No Wi-Fi, no phone service, just me and the trees, which I figured would be perfect. I had arrived around dusk, and the sky was already beginning to darken by the time I finished unpacking. The air was crisp, and the trees were shedding their leaves. The wind picked up a bit, rustling the branches above. There was a slight chill in the air, but it wasn't unbearable. The cabin itself was made of weathered wood, with a large stone fireplace that took up one whole wall. It had a rustic charm to it, with old furniture and wooden floors that creaked when you walked across them. That evening, after I made myself a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, I decided to take a walk around the property. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, and it was getting dark fast. I grabbed a flashlight from the cabin and set off along a narrow trail that wound through the woods behind the cabin. The path was overgrown in some parts, but I didn't mind. It felt peaceful, the only sounds being the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the occasional call of an owl in the distance. As I walked further, the air felt colder, and the wind seemed to have picked up again. I could see the moon through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every little sound, like the rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig underfoot. I stopped for a moment and listened. There was no movement, no animals, no sign of life, just the wind and the trees. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the isolation of the place making me more aware of my surroundings. I continued down the trail, the flashlight beam bouncing off the bark of the trees. I had gone about half a mile when I noticed something odd. In the distance, beyond the trees, there was a faint light, flickering like a campfire. It seemed out of place. I hadn't seen any signs of other people since I arrived, and the nearest town was miles away. Curious, I decided to investigate. I walked towards the light, my footsteps slow and careful as I moved through the dark forest. The light grew brighter the closer I got, and I could now see that it was coming from what appeared to be a small clearing. As I approached, I began to hear something else. A low hum, almost like a distant drone. It sounded mechanical, out of place in the natural surroundings. I didn't know what to think. Maybe there was someone else out here, camping or using a generator. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I froze. The light was coming from a small, makeshift fire pit in the center, but the source of the humming was not a generator or any kind of machinery. It was coming from an old, rusted van, parked just off to the side. The van was in bad shape, its paint chipped and peeling, and there were strange markings on the side. The doors were wide open, but there was no one around. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whole scene felt wrong. I stepped back, my mind racing. There were no other signs of life, no footprints or trail markings, nothing that would suggest anyone had been in this area recently. I glanced around again, trying to get a better sense of my surroundings. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling. There were objects scattered around the clearing, things that didn't belong in the woods. Old, torn-up furniture, broken glass bottles, and strange tools that looked like they belonged to a mechanic or someone who worked with machines. It was like a junkyard hidden away in the woods. I turned around, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had seen enough. This place was wrong, and I needed to get back to the cabin. Fast. But as I started to walk away, I heard a sound behind me. A crunch, like footsteps on the dry leaves. My heart stopped. I froze, my body tense, and slowly, I turned around. There was nothing there. The clearing was empty. The van sat motionless, the flickering fire casting strange shadows around it. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I started to back away, my eyes scanning the trees around me. That's when I heard it again. A low, almost imperceptible rustling sound, followed by a soft creak. My flashlight flickered, and I almost dropped it in a panic. I stood still for a moment, straining my ears, but the sound stopped. The forest was silent once again, and I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if something was truly out there, but I didn't want to find out. I turned and sprinted back down the trail, the light from my flashlight bouncing wildly in front of me. My heart was racing, my thoughts scattered. I didn't dare look behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following. The crunching of leaves, the faint hum of the van, the eerie silence that came after. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to the cabin. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hands trembling. My breath was ragged, and I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm down. The cabin felt safe, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I checked the windows, making sure they were secure, and I closed the blinds, even though there was no one to see. I turned on every light in the cabin, hoping the brightness would chase away the unease that had settled in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises outside, the sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling. Every time I drifted off, I would wake with a start, convinced I had heard something. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally managed to fall into a restless sleep. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. I made myself some coffee and sat by the window, looking out at the woods. The cabin felt peaceful again in the daylight, the forest no longer as menacing as it had seemed the night before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to go back to the clearing where I had seen the van, hoping it was all just a figment of my imagination. Maybe I had been spooked by the isolation, the dark woods playing tricks on me. But when I got there, I was shocked to find that the van was gone. The clearing was just as I had left it, with the odd objects scattered around, but there was no sign of anyone having been there recently. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it. Maybe it had all been a dream, a strange combination of exhaustion and isolation. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, and I knew that I wasn't the only one out there in those woods. I didn't stay another night. I packed up and left, not wanting to risk being out there again. The forest, the cabin, the clearing with the van, everything felt off. Maybe I had imagined some of it, maybe not, but I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. As I drove back towards civilization, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But the road was empty, and the woods seemed peaceful again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, something that I didn't quite understand. I guess I'd never really know what it was. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. My friends and I had rented a small cabin tucked away in the woods, about 2 hours from the city. The plan was simple: get away from the noise, relax, and spend some time enjoying nature. The cabin was a cozy little place, isolated enough that we didn't have to worry about any distractions. The weather was perfect when we arrived, crisp, cool, and sunny, the kind of day that makes you forget about everything else. The cabin itself was rustic, built out of logs and surrounded by tall trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. There was a porch that wrapped around, a wood-burning stove inside, and an old-fashioned charm that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. We unloaded our stuff, got the fire going in the stove, and started settling in. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, and the only connection to the outside world was a single bar of cell service if you stood on the porch. It felt like the perfect place to disconnect. That first night, we spent time playing cards, laughing, and just enjoying the warmth of the fire. As the night deepened, the shadows outside the windows grew longer, the wind picked up, and the world outside seemed to grow quieter. It was the kind of silence that starts to feel eerie after a while. The only sounds were the occasional crackling of the fire and the wind rustling the trees. We joked about how creepy it would be if we were to hear something strange in the woods, but it was all in good fun. None of us actually thought anything like that would happen. Around midnight, we decided to go outside for a bit. We grabbed some flashlights, stepped out onto the porch, and made our way into the woods behind the cabin. The trees were dense, and the trail we followed was barely more than a narrow path that seemed to vanish into the darkness. We walked for about 20 minutes, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the night. There was something oddly peaceful about it, though the silence still felt thick, almost oppressive. No animals stirred, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of our feet crunching on the dry leaves and twigs. It was when we turned to head back that things started to feel off. The air seemed colder, and the silence deepened, pressing in on us. I turned to say something to one of my friends, but the words stuck in my throat. There was something in the distance. I couldn't place it at first, but then I realized what it was. A figure, a person or what looked like a person, standing a good distance away in the trees. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't moving, just standing still, watching us. My breath caught in my throat. "Guys," I whispered, not wanting to break the stillness, but knowing I had to. "Do you see that?" The others turned, and their faces went pale as they saw it too. There, in the dark woods, stood a figure in what appeared to be a heavy jacket or some kind of outerwear, standing completely still. At first, I thought it might be another hiker or someone else in the area, but something about it didn't sit right. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but it was positioned in a way that seemed deliberate, like it had been waiting for us. We stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wasn't sure if the figure had noticed us or if it was just standing there aimlessly. But then, as if it had sensed our gaze, it began to move, slowly and then faster. The figure darted between the trees, its movements jerky, like it was in a hurry or trying to hide. It didn't seem like someone out for a leisurely walk. It looked more like someone trying to avoid being seen. Without saying a word, we all started to back up, our feet crunching loudly on the forest floor. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through me as I tried to keep my breathing steady. It was hard not to panic, but I knew we needed to get back to the cabin, to the safety of the firelight. I could feel the tension in the air, a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. As we turned to leave, I glanced back one last time. The figure had stopped. It was standing perfectly still, only now it was closer. I could make out more details. The outline of a person hunched over slightly, wearing a long coat. And then it moved again. Fast, too fast. It darted out of sight, and I could hear it moving through the trees behind us, closer and closer. "Run!" I shouted, and we all broke into a sprint. The path back to the cabin felt longer than it ever had. Every step felt like it was taking us further from safety, but we pushed on, our flashlights bouncing erratically in our hands. The sound of footsteps behind us grew louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was gaining on us. We burst out of the woods and back onto the open ground near the cabin, slamming the door behind us as soon as we were inside. We all stood there, panting and wide-eyed, staring at the door as though it might suddenly open. But the figure didn't follow. We waited for what felt like hours, each of us too afraid to speak. The silence inside the cabin felt different now, thick with tension. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the figure had moved. Fast, unnatural, like it wasn't just trying to get away from us but was toying with us. The rest of the night passed in a blur of nerves. We kept the lights on, the fire burning strong, and no one slept well. I kept thinking I saw shapes in the shadows outside the windows, or heard faint noises in the dark. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. The wind howled, and the trees creaked, but none of it felt natural. It all felt wrong. The next morning, we debated what to do. We wanted to leave, but part of me felt like that would be admitting we were scared, and I wasn't ready to do that. So we decided to stick it out, maybe head into town for supplies and come back later. We needed to clear our heads, get some distance from the night before. We spent the day in town, trying to shake off the lingering unease. The sun was bright, and the chatter in the town square seemed to help ease the tension. But the moment we returned to the cabin, the atmosphere changed again. Felt too quiet. The trees outside the window seemed to loom larger, their branches like twisted fingers reaching toward the house. We spent the evening inside, the fire roaring and the windows shut tight. No one wanted to talk about what happened in the woods. But then, just after dark, we heard something. Tap at the window, then another. My heart leaped into my throat as I looked toward the sound. But when I approached, there was nothing there. No footprints in the dirt, no sign that anyone had been close. It wasn't until we were packing up to leave that I noticed something strange. Something I hadn't seen the night before. A small, worn piece of cloth stuck in the bark of a tree just at the edge of the property, as if someone had left it there intentionally. It looked like the same dark jacket the figure had worn. I don't know how we missed it earlier, but it was impossible to ignore now. That's when it hit me. Whatever had been out there wasn't just some random person. It was something else. Someone had been watching us, maybe even waiting for the right moment to make a move. We left the cabin that day, no longer feeling the peaceful connection to nature we had when we arrived. As we drove away, I looked back at the small cabin nestled in the woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the first people to have experienced something strange there. The woods were quiet again, but it felt like something was still out there, waiting.